It began with a speck of black rock rising out of an endless blue ocean, small on the map, isolated in reality, and destined to become one of the most violent places human beings would ever fight over. Iwo Jima was not a city. It was not a capital. It was not a place anyone planned to live. It was volcanic ash and jagged stone, sulfur in the air, beaches that swallowed boots instead of holding them. And yet, in early 1945, this island became unavoidable. To reach the heart of Japan, the war had to pass through here. There was no way around it. For the American planners, Iwo Jima was meant to be hard but brief. Land. Overwhelm the defenders. Secure the airfields. Move on. The island was small, the timetable optimistic, the expectation was brutal, fighting measured in days. What awaited instead was something far darker. The Japanese defenders did not intend to repel the invasion at the shoreline. They intended to let it happen. They had transformed the island into a subterranean fortress, miles of tunnels carved into volcanic rock, interconnected bunkers, hidden artillery positions, and firing points invisible until they opened fire. Every yard of ground was registered, every approach memorized. The island itself had been weaponized. When the landings began, the silence was unsettling. No immediate storm of gunfire. No obvious resistance. Just the sound of surf and engines. Then, the island erupted. Artillery tore into the beaches. Machine guns opened from concealed positions. Mortars fell with terrifying accuracy. The black sand offered no cover and no footing. Men fell where they stood. Vehicles burned. Units became tangled together in chaos before they could even organize. Progress was measured in feet. Every step forward exposed another firing angle. Every pause invited fire. Every gain had to be defended immediately or lost. Mount Suribachi loomed over everything, a silent observer anchoring the Japanese defenses. As long as it stood, the island could not be secured. And reaching it meant advancing through terrain that gave the defender every advantage. The fighting on Iwo Jima was relentless. There was no rear area, no safe ground, no moment when the island felt quiet. Combat continued day and night. Tunnels allowed defenders to reappear behind advancing units. Positions thought cleared erupted again. Flamethrowers, grenades, and close-quarter combat became necessities rather than options. The battle became intimate in the most terrifying way possible. Casualties mounted at a staggering pace. Entire units were reduced. Medics worked without rest. The wounded waited under fire with nowhere to go. And still, the advance continued because stopping meant dying in place. When the flag was raised atop Mount Suribachi, it was not the end. The image would become iconic. The fighting did not stop. For weeks afterward, American forces continued to clear the island inch by inch, tunnel by tunnel, position by position. Japanese resistance did not collapse. It diminished slowly, violently, and at terrible cost on both sides. By the time Iwo Jima was finally declared secure, the numbers told a story no photograph ever could. More than half of the American casualties in the entire Pacific War occurred on this single island. Nearly the entire Japanese garrison was killed. The island had been taken, but it had extracted a price that reshaped how the rest of the war would be fought. Iwo Jima mattered because it showed the future. It showed what an invasion of the Japanese home islands would look like. It showed the cost of fanatic defense. It showed that victory in the Pacific would not come cleanly or quickly. The airfields captured on Iwo Jima would save countless lives, later providing emergency landing sites for damaged bombers. But that strategic value was paid for up front, in blood, ash, and endurance. Tonight, we return to that island, to the black sand beaches and sulfur air, to the tunnels beneath the ground and the fire above it, to the battle that stripped war of any remaining illusion, to Iwo Jima where courage, sacrifice, and suffering collided on a scale few places ever have. And, before we go any further, if you're still here, listening carefully, if these long, immersive journeys into history help you slow down, reflect, or feel connected to something deeper than the noise of the day, then I hope you'll consider subscribing. I'm a small creator, building this channel one story at a time with care, respect, and patience. Subscribing doesn't just help the channel grow, it tells me this kind of storytelling matters to you. It keeps this quiet, thoughtful space alive. If this place gives you perspective, calm, or a moment to sit with history honestly, then stay with me. Settle in. This is the Battle of Iwo Jima, November 3rd, 1944. A conference room in Pearl Harbor, bathed in the harsh light of afternoon sun, filtering through Venetian blinds. Admiral Chester Nimitz stood before a wall-sized map of the Pacific, his finger hovering over a speck of volcanic rock, halfway between the Mariana Islands and Tokyo. The island was so small, it barely registered on most maps 8 square miles of black sand and sulfur mines that most Americans had never heard of. Its name was Iwo Jima, Japanese for Sulphur Island, and in the next 3 months, it would consume more American lives per square yard than any battlefield in Marine Corps history. But on this November afternoon, as staff officers circled the tiny landmass with grease pencils and rulers, calculating distances and payload capacities, none of them truly understood what they were proposing. They saw an airfield. They saw a strategic stepping stone. What they didn't see, what they couldn't see, were the 11 miles of tunnels already being carved beneath that volcanic surface, or the brilliant, Harvard-educated Japanese general who was transforming military doctrine itself in those sulfur-choked depths. The strategic calculus seemed simple, almost mathematical in its clarity. American B-29 superfortresses were flying 3,000-mile round trips from bases in Saipan and Tinian to bomb the Japanese mainland. The distances were crushing. Crews spent 14 hours in unpressurized aircraft, burning fuel at rates that left almost no margin for error or battle damage. If an engine failed, if flak tore through a fuel tank, if a Zero's bullets found their mark, the crew faced a terrible choice: bail out over Japan and face certain death or torture, or ditch in the Pacific and hope the submarine service could find them in 16 million square miles of ocean. The survival rate for ditched crews was less than 5%. By October 1944, American air crews were experiencing something close to psychological collapse. Young men were volunteering for European bombing runs, where German fighters and flak killed 1 in 4 airmen rather than face the Pacific's emptiness. Intelligence officers calculated that for every 100 B-29s dispatched to Japan, 6 never returned. The losses were unsustainable. Then, someone noticed Iwo Jima on the map. The island sat almost exactly halfway between Saipan and Tokyo, 660 miles from the Japanese capital, 1,200 miles from American bases. With Iwo Jima in American hands, fighters could escort the bombers all the way to target. Damaged bombers could make emergency landings instead of ditching at sea. The island's airfields could launch their own strikes against Japan. The mathematics were compelling. Possession of Iwo Jima could potentially save thousands of American airmen's lives. But there was another calculation hidden in those numbers, one that wouldn't become clear until Marines were dying on black sand beaches. Taking Iwo Jima would cost nearly 27,000 American casualties, more than the populations of many American towns. The question that would haunt historians for decades was already implicit in that Pearl Harbor conference room. Would the lives saved equal the lives spent? Could they? What the Americans didn't know, what their intelligence apparatus had completely failed to detect, was that Iwo Jima was already transforming into something unprecedented in the Pacific War. Since June 1944, a Japanese garrison that had grown from 5,000 to 21,000 men had been digging. Not simple foxholes or basic bunkers, but a subterranean fortress of staggering complexity. 3-story command centers with reinforced concrete ceilings 5 feet thick. Artillery positions hidden in caves with retractable steel doors. A tunnel network so extensive that troops could move from one end of the island to the other without ever appearing on the surface. American reconnaissance photos showed surface fortifications being built, then destroyed by bombing, then rebuilt. What the photos didn't show, what they couldn't show, was that this was deliberate deception. The real fortress was being constructed 75 feet underground, beyond the reach of naval guns or aerial bombs. The man directing this transformation was Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, and he was unlike any Japanese commander American forces had yet encountered. At 53 years old, Kuribayashi had studied at Harvard, traveled extensively across America in the 1920s, and served as a military attaché in Washington. He had visited Detroit automobile factories, watched Hollywood films, toured American military bases. Unlike many Japanese officers who dismissed American industrial might or believed in spiritual superiority over material strength, Suribachi understood exactly what his country was fighting. He had walked American streets, eaten American food, met American families. He knew the factories of Detroit could produce more tanks in a month than Japan built in a year. He had seen the American electrical grid, the highway system, the vast farmlands of the Midwest. When he received orders to defend Iwo Jima in June 1944, Suribachi understood something his superiors in Tokyo had not yet accepted. Japan had already lost the war. But knowing defeat is inevitable doesn't mean accepting it without cost. Suribachi's orders were clear. Hold Iwo Jima for as long as possible. Bleed the Americans. Buy time for the home islands to prepare defenses. What he did with those orders would revolutionize defensive warfare. Traditional Japanese military doctrine called for defending at the water's edge, mass troops on beaches, repel the invasion before it gains a foothold, launch glorious banzai charges when positions are overrun. Suribachi rejected every element of this approach. He studied American tactics from Tarawa, Saipan, and Peleliu. He analyzed where Americans were most effective and where they struggled. His conclusions were radical. Let the Americans land unopened. Draw them inland where naval gunfire can't support them. Fight from concealment and never charge. Make them pay for every yard in blood. When his officers protested that this was dishonorable, that it violated Bushido, Suribachi was blunt. Honor doesn't stop bullets, and glorious deaths don't hold ground. His job wasn't to die gloriously. It was to kill Americans, as many as possible, for as long as possible. By November 1944, when Admiral Nimitz's staff was drawing circles on maps in Pearl Harbor, Suribachi's vision was taking physical form in volcanic rock. Korean forced laborers and Japanese engineers worked in conditions that bordered on inhuman temperatures. In the tunnels reached 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Sulfur fumes burned lungs, and cave-ins killed dozens of workers. They were building something that had never existed before, a fortress designed not to win, but to maximize enemy casualties while losing. Artillery pieces were positioned in caves that could be sealed and reopened, allowing guns to fire, disappear, then reappear in different positions. Fake positions outnumbered real ones, 3-1, drawing American fire away from actual defensive works. Bunkers were connected by tunnels so that destroyed positions could be reoccupied within hours. The volcanic rock that made digging so difficult also made the resulting fortifications nearly indestructible naval shells that could penetrate 3 feet of reinforced concrete, barely scratched volcanic rock 75 feet thick. The intelligence failure was almost total. American photo reconnaissance showed activity on Iwo Jima, but analysts interpreted what they saw through the lens of previous battles. They saw bunkers being built and destroyed and rebuilt, and concluded the Japanese were repairing bombing damage. They didn't consider that surface construction might be deliberate deception covering subsurface work. Submarine periscope observations noted continuous construction activity, but couldn't penetrate below the surface. The initial intelligence estimate concluded Iwo Jima was defended by approximately 13,000 Japanese troops in conventional fortifications. The real number was 21,000 men in a fortress unlike anything American forces had encountered. When Marine planners estimated the island could be taken in 5 to 7 days a week of hard fighting, then victory they were working with incomplete information that would cost thousands of lives. But even if American intelligence had been perfect, even if they'd known exactly what waited beneath Iwo Jima's surface, the strategic calculus might not have changed. By late 1944, the bombing campaign against Japan was considered essential to ending the war. Every week, American submarines were strangling Japan's merchant fleet, cutting off oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Indochina, food from Korea. The Japanese economy was collapsing. American planners believed sustained strategic bombing could force Japanese surrender without the need for a ground invasion of the home islands, an invasion projected to cost 500,000 American casualties. But the bombing campaign required Iwo Jima. Without it, too many bombers were being lost. Too many crews were dying. The island was tiny, barely visible on maps, but it sat at the center of the entire strategic endgame. Taking it was necessary. That necessity would justify almost any cost, or so they believed. On December 8, 1944, exactly 3 years after Pearl Harbor, the first B-24 Liberator bombers struck Iwo Jima, beginning what would become 72 consecutive days of bombing. It was the longest pre-invasion bombardment in Pacific War history. By the time Marines landed on February 19, 1945, American forces would have dropped 6,800 tons of bombs and fired 14,000 naval shells at an island 5 miles long and 2.5 miles wide. It was enough explosives to theoretically obliterate the surface twice over. But Kuribayashi's fortress wasn't on the surface. It was underneath, waiting in darkness and heat and sulfur fumes. The Japanese general had written to his wife in October, "Do not plan for my return. We will fight here, and we will die here, but we will make them pay such a price they will remember this island forever." In Pearl Harbor, admirals were circling a map with confident grease pencil marks. In Washington, strategists were calculating lives saved versus lives spent. And on Iwo Jima, 21,000 Japanese soldiers were digging deeper into volcanic rock, checking ammunition stores, and waiting for Americans who believed they would win in a week. June 8, 1944. The landing craft's ramp dropped onto black sand, and Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi stepped onto Iwo Jima for the first time. The heat hit him immediately, not just tropical heat, but something more oppressive, sulfuric, tinged with volcanic fumes that made breathing difficult. Mount Suribachi loomed to his left, its 556-foot peak shrouded in clouds of sulfur steam. To his right, his new command was assembled for inspection. 5,000 Japanese soldiers standing in formation on what passed for a parade ground near the island's main airfield. They looked confident, perhaps even eager. Kuribayashi felt something between pity and anger. These men had been taught to die gloriously. He would have to teach them something more difficult: how to kill efficiently while dying slowly. Within weeks, he would revolutionize defensive doctrine in ways that would influence military tactics for generations. But first, he had to convince his officers that everything they'd been taught about honor and warfare was wrong. His first inspection tour of the island's defenses confirmed his worst fears. The previous commander had followed standard Japanese defensive doctrine to the letter. Troops concentrated near beaches to repel invasion at the water's edge, artillery positions on high ground for maximum visibility, supplies stored in obvious locations near the airfields. Kuribayashi walked the beaches where landing craft would arrive, stood where American Marines would stand, and saw exactly what they would see: a conventional defense that could be shattered by overwhelming naval gunfire. That night, at his first command meeting, he shocked his staff by declaring their entire defensive plan worthless. Beach defenses would be abandoned, artillery would be hidden. The beaches would be undefended killing grounds, not fortress walls. His officers were horrified. Colonel Tadashi Takaishi, commander of the island's tank regiment, stood and declared this plan violated every principle of Bushido. Kuribayashi's response was brutal in its honesty. Bushido does not stop 16-inch naval shells. Bravery does not defeat B-29 bombers. Our job is not to die with honor. Our job is to kill Americans. What made Kuribayashi different, what made him dangerous, was that he knew America. Not the America of propaganda films or intelligence reports, but the real nation he'd lived in during the 1920s. He had studied at Harvard from 1928 to 1930, living in Cambridge, Massachusetts, attending lectures, befriending American students. He had traveled by train from Boston to Los Angeles, visiting Detroit's automobile factories, Chicago's stockyards, California's oil fields. He had watched The Jazz Singer, the first talking picture, in a New York theater. He had eaten Thanksgiving dinner with an American family in Pennsylvania, helped carve the turkey, listened to their stories. While other Japanese officers spoke of American spiritual weakness and love of luxury, Kuribayashi remembered Detroit factories that operated 24 hours a day, each producing more vehicles in a week than Japan's entire automotive industry built in a year. He had seen Kansas wheat fields stretching to the horizon, Texas oil derricks pumping wealth from the ground, the electrical grid lighting cities that never slept. Japan, he understood, was fighting an industrial colossus. It would lose. The only question was how much that victory would cost America. His defensive philosophy emerged from this understanding. If Japan could make American victories expensive enough, perhaps peace terms might be negotiated instead of unconditional surrender demanded. Each island Japan held would cost American lives. Each week the war continued, would fill American newspapers with casualty lists, strain American patience, create political pressure for negotiated settlement. Iwo Jima was tiny 8 square miles of volcanic rock with no strategic resources beyond its airfields. But its location made it valuable to America, and its terrain made it defensible. Suribachi could not win here. He could not even hope to hold the island permanently. What he could do was turn it into a killing ground so effective, so costly in American blood, that strategists would think twice before invading the next island, and the next. His goal was mathematical: kill 10 Americans for every Japanese defender. With 21,000 men, that meant 210,000 American casualties. It was an impossible ratio. Suribachi would come closer to achieving it than anyone expected. The transformation began with tunnels. Iwo Jima's volcanic geology was simultaneously terrible for digging and perfect for fortification. The island was composed of compressed volcanic ash and rock, honeycombed with natural caves formed by ancient lava flows. Digging through it was brutally hard. The rock was dense enough to dull tools rapidly. The heat underground was crushing. Sulfur fumes caused chemical burns and respiratory damage. But once dug, the volcanic rock formed walls stronger than reinforced concrete. Naval shells that could demolish 3 feet of concrete barely chipped volcanic rock. Suribachi ordered his engineers to expand natural caves and connect them with artificial tunnels, creating a 3-dimensional fortress. By August 1944, Korean forced laborers and Japanese soldiers were working in shifts around the clock. Casualties from cave-ins, heat exhaustion, and sulfur poisoning were accepted as necessary costs. The fortress had to be ready before the Americans came. The tunnel system's design was brilliant in its lethality. Each defensive position was connected to at least 2 other positions by underground passages, allowing troops to retreat when under direct attack, then reoccupy the position after American forces moved past. Artillery and mortar positions were constructed in caves with retractable steel doors. Guns could fire, doors could close, and, from the outside, the position looked like solid rock. Ventilation shafts were cleverly disguised as natural volcanic vents, making the air circulation system nearly invisible to aerial reconnaissance. Living chambers were dug deep enough to withstand naval bombardment, stocked with food for 6 months, water for 3, and ammunition sufficient for weeks of sustained combat. By October 1944, the fortress contained 11 miles of tunnels, some sections 3 stories deep. American intelligence, studying aerial photographs, saw some surface bunkers and concluded Iwo Jima was moderately defended. They had no idea they were looking at the roof of an underground city designed for killing. Suribachi's tactical orders were equally revolutionary. He issued specific written instructions to every unit commander: no banzai charges under any circumstances, no water's edge defense, no wasteful glory. His operational order, distributed in November 1944, was remarkable for its cold logic. We shall not die quickly. We shall infiltrate into the midst of the enemy and annihilate them. Each man will make it his duty to kill 10 enemy soldiers. Until we are destroyed to the last man, we shall harass the enemy with guerrilla tactics. Traditional Japanese tactics called for massed charges against enemy positions, spiritually satisfying, visually dramatic, and tactically suicidal against American firepower. Suribachi banned them outright. Soldiers would fight from concealment. They would retreat through tunnels when positions became untenable. They would reoccupy positions behind American lines. They would turn the island into a maze where every advance cost blood, where nothing was as it appeared, where victory came in yards purchased with lives. His officers resisted. The concept of fighting from hiding, of refusing glorious death charges, of valuing killing over dying, all of it violated deeply ingrained cultural norms. Major Yoshitaka Hori, Suribachi's communications officer, later recalled heated debates in the command bunker. Senior officers argued that soldiers who refused to die gloriously would lose fighting spirit, that defense without honor was worse than death, that Japanese warriors had never fought this way and shouldn't start now. Suribachi listened patiently, then read casualty reports from previous battles. Tarawa, 4,700 Japanese defenders, 4,690 killed in 3 days, garrison destroyed in Banzai, charges that gained nothing. Saipan, 30,000 Japanese defenders, 29,000 killed in 4 weeks, final survivors charging American positions in suicidal waves that were massacred by machine gun fire. Every battle followed the same pattern. Japanese fought bravely, died gloriously, and lost completely. Suribachi's voice was quiet but firm. If you wish to die with honor, I cannot stop you, but you will die after killing 10 Americans, not before. By December 1944, the fortress was nearly complete. American bombers had been pounding the island for weeks, and Suribachi used each raid to test his defensive concepts. After bombardments, he would send observers to assess damage. Surface bunkers were destroyed, as expected. Underground positions were untouched. Fake positions drew bombs away from real positions. The Americans were fighting a shadow defense, wasting ordnance on decoys while real positions remained hidden. Suribachi refined his tactics based on these observations. Artillery crews practiced rapid firing and retreating into caves, fire 3 shells, close the steel doors, wait for counter-battery fire to pass, reopen, and fire again. Snipers were assigned specific fields of fire with multiple fallback positions, all connected by tunnels. Machine gun positions were sited not for wide fields of fire, but for interlocking coverage of specific kill zones. Nothing was conventional. Everything was designed to inflict maximum casualties while preserving defensive forces as long as possible. In his quarters, a Spartan chamber carved from volcanic rock, 75 feet underground, Suribachi wrote letters home by candlelight. His wife, Yoshi, received perhaps 50 letters during his time on Iwo Jima. The tone was always the same, loving, reflective, accepting of death. "The battle is drawing near," he wrote in January 1945. "I do not expect to survive. Please raise our children to be good Japanese, but also to understand that war brings only sadness." He wrote about cherry blossoms he would never see again, about his daughter's graduation he would miss, about his son, whom he hoped would choose a path other than military service. There was no glory in these letters, no bravado about dying for the emperor, just a middle-aged man saying goodbye to his family, knowing he had months to live, perhaps weeks. But there was also steel in those letters, a cold determination. "I will make the Americans pay for this island. I will turn our deaths into their nightmare." Suribachi understood he was creating a precedent. If Iwo Jima cost enough American lives, if the defensive tactics proved effective enough, they would be replicated on Okinawa, then Kyushu, then Honshu. Every island could become another Iwo Jima. The home islands could become a graveyard for American ambitions. July 23, 1944. Lee Bong-soo was 19 years old, 5,000 miles from his home in Korea, and dying of thirst in a tunnel 140 degrees Fahrenheit. The volcanic rock surrounding him radiated heat like an oven. Sulfur fumes made every breath burn. His hands were bleeding from swinging a pickaxe for 12 hours straight, chipping away at volcanic stone that dulled the blade after every dozen strikes. The Japanese engineers had promised the Korean laborers that tunnel work on Iwo Jima would be hard but brief, a few months, then return home. 6 months later, Lee understood there would be no return. The tunnels were consuming them. Workers collapsed from heat exhaustion every day. Cave-ins killed dozens. Sulfur poisoning caused respiratory failure. And there were no doctors, only soldiers who dragged bodies to the surface and sent new workers down. Lee had watched 2 friends die in the tunnels. When he asked a Japanese engineer when the work would be finished, the engineer's answer was blunt: "When you're all dead or the Americans arrive, whichever comes first." The forced labor program was massive in scale and brutal in execution. Approximately 1,300 Korean laborers were brought to Iwo Jima between June and December 1944, along with 1,200 Japanese construction troops and 60 civilian engineers. Their mission was physically impossible by normal construction standards. Excavate 11 miles of tunnels through volcanic rock, Construct 3-story command bunkers with reinforced ceilings. Install ventilation systems, build artillery chambers with retractable steel doors, create underground hospitals and ammunition depots and living quarters for 21,000 men, all in less than a year, all while American B-24s bombed the surface daily. The engineers approached it as they would approach any construction project, by working men to death. Shifts ran 18 hours in the tunnels, 6 hours rest on the surface. Food was minimal, rice and pickled vegetables, barely enough calories for surface work, utterly insufficient for the physical demands of tunnel excavation. Medical care was non-existent. Workers who collapsed were replaced. Bodies were buried in mass graves on the northern coast. The volcanic geology made every yard of progress agonizing. Iwo Jima's rock wasn't uniform layers of compressed volcanic ash, alternated with dense basalt and pockets of loose pumice. Some sections could be excavated relatively quickly, with explosives and picks. Other sections required drilling and blasting, then hand removal of thousands of tons of shattered rock. The heat was omnipresent. Iwo Jima's name, Sulphur Island, was descriptive, not poetic. The island was essentially an active volcanic formation, its rocks heated by magma chambers below. Surface temperatures reached 110 degrees. Underground, trapped heat radiated from the walls, and temperatures climbed to 140 degrees in enclosed spaces. Workers stripped to loincloths, soaked cloth in water, and tied it around their heads, and worked until heat exhaustion forced them to retreat. Many never woke up after collapsing. The sulfur was worse than the heat. Hydrogen sulfide gas seeped from cracks in the rock, colorless and deadly. Low concentrations caused eye irritation and respiratory distress. Higher concentrations caused convulsions and death. Engineers installed bamboo ventilation tubes, but they were inadequate. Crews entering new tunnel sections sometimes collapsed within minutes. Yet, the work continued, driven by Suribachi's relentless vision and Japanese engineering expertise. The tunnel network wasn't random, it was carefully planned, with different sections serving specific functions. The command center was excavated beneath the northern plateau, 75 feet underground, accessible through 4 separate entrance tunnels that could be collapsed to prevent penetration. The main chamber was 40 feet long, 20 feet wide, with a ceiling reinforced by steel beams salvaged from destroyed surface buildings and concrete poured 5 feet thick. Communication cables were run through smaller tunnels to observation posts across the island. Electric generators were installed in separate chambers with exhaust vents disguised as natural volcanic steam outlets. By September 1944, Suribachi could sit in his underground headquarters and receive real-time reports from every major defensive position on the island. The Americans had nothing comparable. They wouldn't encounter anything like it for decades. Not until Vietnam's Cu Chi tunnels would American forces face a similar subterranean fortress. The artillery positions represented the pinnacle of the fortress design. Traditional coastal defense placed guns on high ground for maximum range and visibility, and made them visible targets for naval gunfire and aerial bombardment. Suribachi's concept inverted this logic. Hide the guns underground, give them minimal exposure during firing, make them vanish between shots. Engineers carved chambers large enough to hold Type 96 150mm howitzers, massive weapons weighing 9 tons deep into hillsides and cliff faces. Steel tracks were laid so guns could roll forward to firing positions, then roll back into darkness. Hydraulic doors, also salvaged steel reinforced with concrete, could seal the openings. The result was devastating tactical advantage. A gun could fire 3 to 5 rounds in 90 seconds, doors would close, and from the outside the position appeared to be solid rock. American counter-battery fire would pound empty hillsides while the guns remained safe in their caves, ready to roll forward and fire again. The camouflage and deception efforts were equally sophisticated. For every real defensive position, engineers constructed 3 fake positions on the surface. These weren't crude decoys, they were elaborate constructions designed to attract aerial reconnaissance and bombardment. Fake pillboxes built from logs and covered with sand looked real in photographs. Artillery positions made from stacked rocks with gun barrel-shaped logs protruding convinced photo interpreters they were viewing actual weapons. Some fake positions even had Japanese soldiers manning them during the day. maintaining the illusion, while the real garrison stayed underground. American bombs and shells destroyed thousands of these decoys, and intelligence officers checking reconnaissance photos saw destroyed positions and concluded bombardment was effective. The real fortress remained invisible. Japanese soldiers watching from underground observation posts joked darkly about American bombs, killing rocks and sand. The Americans weren't just fighting blind, they were being deliberately deceived about what they were fighting. By October 1944, the scale of construction was straining the island's resources and workforce. Water was scarce. Iwo Jima had no natural freshwater sources beyond rainwater collected in cisterns. Food supplies depended entirely on ships from Japan, running a gauntlet of American submarines. Medical supplies were minimal. Workers and soldiers alike were on reduced rations, losing weight, developing vitamin deficiencies. Yet the work accelerated. American reconnaissance flights reported increased activity, and Suribachi understood this meant invasion was approaching. Tunnels that had been planned for 6 months of construction were being rushed to completion in 4. Civilian engineers collapsed at their drafting tables. Korean laborers died in darkness. Their bodies left where they fell, because removing corpses took time away from digging. The survivors became skeletal, moving like automatons, swinging picks and shoveling debris 18 hours a day, sleeping in caves that stank of sweat and sulfur and death. The defensive armament being installed in these positions was formidable. Beyond the 361 artillery pieces and 65 mortars, Suribachi had positioned 33 naval guns salvaged from damaged ships, including massive 320mm coast defense guns with range exceeding 10 miles. These weapons could engage American ships before they could provide effective fire support to landing forces. Anti-aircraft guns were positioned in caves, able to fire at aircraft, then retreat into darkness before being targeted. Even more deadly were the smaller weapons. Type 92 70mm infantry guns hidden in bunkers overlooking beaches, Type 11 37mm anti-tank guns sighted to fire across landing zones, hundreds of machine gun positions covering interlocking fields of fire. Every weapon had been positioned with mathematical precision. Engineers calculated firing angles, tested fields of fire, ensured that any spot on the landing beaches could be hit by at least 3 weapons simultaneously. The Americans would be wading into precisely calibrated killing zones. The ventilation system was perhaps the most innovative element of the fortress design. The problem was basic but critical. 21,000 men living and fighting underground would generate lethal concentrations of carbon dioxide within hours without air circulation. Traditional ventilation shafts would be visible and vulnerable to bombardment. The solution was elegant engineers in large natural volcanic vents that already dotted the island, connected them to the tunnel network, and used the island's natural convection currents to draw fresh air in and push stale air out. The volcanic heat actually helped warm air rising through the vent shafts, created natural draft that pulled cooler air through the tunnels. Bamboo baffles controlled airflow. The system wasn't perfect, parts of the tunnel network remained poorly ventilated, and some chambers had air so thick with carbon dioxide and sulfur fumes that soldiers could only occupy them for minutes at a time. But it worked well enough to keep most of the garrison alive underground, and from the air the vents looked like natural geological features. American pilots photographed them hundreds of times without understanding their purpose. By January 1945, as American planners in Pearl Harbor finalized invasion timetables, the fortress was functionally complete. 11 miles of tunnels connected 1,500 defensive positions. 361 artillery pieces and mortars were emplaced and camouflaged. Underground storage chambers held 6 months of food, ammunition for weeks of sustained combat, medical supplies for thousands of casualties. The garrison had grown to 21,000 men, 13,000 infantry, 8,000 artillery, and support. They had rehearsed defensive operations for months. Artillery crews could roll guns into firing position, fire, and retreat in under 2 minutes. Infantry could move through tunnels from northern positions to southern positions in 30 minutes. Commanders in the deep bunkers could coordinate defensive fires across the entire island. Lee Bong-soo, the Korean laborer who had arrived in July, believing he would work for 3 months and go home, was now a skeleton manning a machine gun position on the northern plateau. He knew he would die here. They all knew. But Suribachi had promised them one thing. They wouldn't die quickly, and they wouldn't die uselessly. They would take Americans with them. The fortress was ready. Let them come. January 8, 1945. Camp Tarawa, Hawaii. 19-year-old Private First Class Donald Howell stood in formation with 500 other Marines, staring at a massive sand table model of an island he'd never heard of. The model was maybe 20 feet long, carefully sculpted to show terrain features. A mountain at one end, airfields in the middle, rocky ground at the northern end. Officers with pointer sticks were explaining something about landing beaches and objectives, but Howell wasn't really listening. He was watching the faces of the veterans standing nearby, men who'd fought at Tarawa, at Saipan, at Tinian. Their expressions bothered him. These were Marines who'd seen combat, who wore campaign ribbons, who'd killed and survived. They should look confident, maybe even bored at another pre-invasion briefing. Instead, they looked worried. One sergeant, a weathered 30-year-old from Tennessee named Hank Mitchell, leaned over and whispered to Howell, "Kid, you're going to learn something on this island. Pray you live long enough for the lesson to matter." Howell wanted to ask what he meant. Mitchell was already walking away, heading back to the tents to write letters home. Later, Howell would learn that veterans called those death letters, written before battle, held by chaplains, mailed if you didn't come back. The Marines, gathering in Hawaii, represented the finest amphibious assault force in human history, not opinion, but measurable fact based on training, equipment, and doctrine. The 5th Amphibious Corps consisted of 3 Marine divisions, the 3rd, 4th, and 5th, totaling 70,647 men. They'd trained for 6 months specifically for this operation, rehearsing on beaches that approximated Iwo Jima's terrain, practicing with equipment designed to solve problems encountered in previous battles. The 4th Marine Division had fought at Kwajalein and Saipan. The 5th was newly formed but trained by Saipan veterans, and elements of the 3rd were hardened from Bougainville and Guam. They represented every region of America: farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, college students from California, coal miners from West Virginia. Average age was 19 to 20 years old. 30% had never seen combat. They would be landing against an enemy they vastly outnumbered, on an island they'd been told would fall in 5 to 7 days. Senior officers were already discussing where the divisions would be sent after Iwo Jima, probably Okinawa, in April, then maybe the invasion of Japan itself later that year. The planning assumed Iwo Jima was a stepping stone, not a meat grinder. The training intensity was unprecedented, shaped by hard lessons from previous campaigns. At Tarawa in November 1943, Marines had waded ashore through chest-deep water after landing craft grounded on coral reefs, taking heavy casualties before reaching the beach. The lesson learned: develop amphibious tractors that could cross reefs. By January 1945, the Marines had LVT-4 amphibious tractors, armored, tracked vehicles that could traverse reefs and beach obstacles, carrying 20 troops or 4,000 pounds of cargo. At Saipan in June 1944, Japanese defenders in caves had survived naval bombardment, then emerged to slaughter Marines advancing inland. Lesson learned: bring specialized weapons for cave warfare. The Marines bound for Iwo Jima carried M22 flamethrowers with improved range, demo charges with shape charges for bunker busting, and more bazookas per infantry company than any previous operation. At Peleliu in September 1944, inadequate tank support had cost lives. Lesson learned: attach more armor. The Marines would land with 8 tank battalions, 226 Sherman tanks mounting 75mm guns. The weapons and equipment represented the cutting edge of amphibious warfare technology. The basic Marine infantry loadout weighed 85 pounds. M1 Garand rifle, 120 rounds of 30, .6 ammunition, 6 grenades, 2 canteens, combat knife, entrenching tool, first aid kit, gas mask, shelter half, rations for 3 days. Specialized troops carried additional equipment. Flamethrower operators lugged 68-pound flamethrower units. Demolition men carried 40 pounds of explosives. Radio operators hauled 35-pound radio sets. Machine gun crews divided the weight of M1919A, 6 machine guns and ammunition. Mortar crews carried M2, 60mm mortars, and high explosive rounds. Officers carried M1 carbines and binoculars. Corpsmen Navy medics attached to Marine units carried medical supplies weighing 30 pounds. Morphine syrettes, battle dressings, sulfa powder, surgical instruments, blood plasma. Every item had been tested, modified, and refined based on combat experience. The Marines landing on Iwo Jima would carry the best infantry equipment in the world. But equipment and training couldn't address the fundamental problem. Nobody knew what they were landing into. Intelligence briefings described Iwo Jima as heavily defended, with extensive fortifications. Aerial photos showed bunkers, artillery positions, and anti-aircraft guns. What the photos didn't show, what they couldn't show, was the underground fortress. Intelligence estimates placed Japanese strength at 13,000 men, approximately accurate on numbers, but utterly wrong on disposition. Planners assumed most defensive positions were on the surface, that naval bombardment would destroy or suppress them, that Marines could advance inland rapidly after landing. Combat veterans had learned to distrust intelligence estimates at Tarawa. Intelligence had said the island would be lightly defended. At Saipan, they'd underestimated garrison strength by 10,000 men. The veterans training in Hawaii understood that whatever intelligence said, reality would be worse. They just didn't know how much worse. The psychological preparation was as important as the physical training. Marine Corps training doctrine emphasized aggression, initiative, and the offensive mindset attack. Always attack, hesitation, costs lives. Recruits at boot camp were taught to think of themselves as warriors, killers, instruments of American power. This psychological conditioning was necessary. Asking young men to run toward machine gun fire requires overriding survival instincts. But it created a paradox on Iwo Jima. Marines trained to attack aggressively would face an enemy who refused to meet that aggression with static defense or suicidal charges. Suribachi's doctrine of defense in depth, fighting from concealment, trading space for time, these concepts were antithetical to Japanese tactical culture. As Americans understood it, Marines expected banzai charges, glorious last stands, irrational behavior. What they would encounter was cold calculation, methodical killing, and an enemy who fought smart instead of brave. The psychological shock would be profound. Personal preparation varied by individual. Some Marines wrote letters home, death letters, or just-in-case letters, given to chaplains with instructions to mail if the writer didn't survive. Private Howell wrote to his parents in Indiana, "Don't worry about me, I've got good buddies and good sergeants. We'll take the island, then I'll write again." He folded the letter, sealed it, handed it to the chaplain, and tried not to think about what it meant. Some Marines sharpened knives, cleaned rifles for the 10th time, checked equipment obsessively. Others joked and played cards, using humor to blunt anxiety. Sergeant Mitchell, the Tarawa veteran, sat alone writing in a small notebook, not letters, but a diary. He'd been keeping it since Tarawa, filling it with observations about combat. What worked, what didn't, how to survive. His entry for January 8th, 1945, was brief. Another island. Everyone says it'll be quick. The new guys believe it. The officers pretend to believe it. Those of us who've done this before know better. This one feels different. Can't explain why, just does. The loading process in early February was organized chaos. 70,000 Marines, their equipment, vehicles, and supplies had to be loaded onto 450 ships in precise order items needed. First had to load last, so they could be unloaded first. Combat teams loaded on attack transports, their equipment on attack cargo ships, tanks loaded on LST's landing ship, tank capable of running directly onto beaches and discharging vehicles. Artillery loaded on APE attack personnel assault ships, with davits to lower howitzers into landing craft. Supplies loaded on AKA attack cargo ships with cranes and holds configured for rapid unloading. The loading sequence had been refined through 4 years of Pacific campaigns, evolved from the chaos of Guadalcanal to the precision of Saipan. By February 10th, the convoy was forming up 450 vessels, carrying 70,000 Marines and 30,000 support personnel, consuming enough fuel daily to power a medium American city, carrying enough ammunition to fight a battle larger than most conflicts in human history, all focused on 8 square miles of volcanic rock that most Americans still couldn't find on a map. The convoy departed Hawaii on February 10th and 11th, task forces leaving in sequence, then joining in formation. Crossing the Pacific took 8 days at convoy, speed 12 to 14 knots, zigzagging to avoid submarines, destroyers screening the perimeter, carriers providing air cover. Aboard the transports, Marines filled time, cleaning weapons, playing cards, sleeping, writing letters they hoped wouldn't be mailed posthumously. Some attended religious services, Protestant, Catholic, Jewish chaplains conducting worship on steel decks, praying for men who would storm a volcanic island. On February 17th, 2 days before landing, the convoy rendezvoused with the fire support ships, battleships, cruisers, destroyers that would provide pre-invasion bombardment. From the transport decks, Marines could see the firepower arrayed to support them. 16 battleships, including USS Nevada, a Pearl Harbor survivor, and USS New York, whose bow contained steel from the destroyed World Trade Center beams from 1901. The sheer mass of naval power was reassuring. Nobody could survive the bombardment they were about to deliver. Or so the Marines believed. On February 18th, the island came into view, a dark smudge on the horizon that gradually resolved into volcanic rock dominated by Mount Suribachi at the southern end. Marines lined the rails, staring at their objective. Private Howell thought it looked small, smaller than he'd expected from the sand table models. Sergeant Mitchell stood beside him, binoculars focused on the beaches. "See anything?" Howell asked. Mitchell was silent for a long moment. "That's what bothers me. Don't see anything. No movement, no activity. They're letting us look." "That means they're not worried about what we're seeing." He lowered the binoculars. "This island doesn't care if we know it's there. That's not how enemies behave when they're scared." Howell wanted to ask what it meant, but Mitchell was walking away, heading below deck to check his equipment one more time. Around them, naval guns began to roar. The bombardment had begun. 70,000 Marines prepared for battle, most of them believing they'd won before they landed. In the tunnels beneath Iwo Jima, 21,000 Japanese soldiers checked ammunition stocks, positioned weapons, and waited. The storm was about to break. February 19th, 1945, 0645 hours. USS Nevada's 16-inch guns fired simultaneously, 8 barrels erupting in flame visible for miles. The shells, each weighing 2,700 pounds, traveling at 2,500 feet per second, arced across 7 miles of ocean and impacted Mount Suribachi with force equivalent to small earthquakes. The mountain disappeared in smoke and debris. Across the invasion fleet, 445 warships joined the barrage. Cruisers firing 8-inch guns, destroyers pumping 5-inch shells, rocket ships launching rippling salvos of 4.5-inch rockets. In 3 hours, American forces would fire 14,000 shells at an island 5 miles long and 2.5 miles wide. The noise was beyond description, a continuous roar that physical thunder merged into physical pressure, felt in the chest, rattling teeth. On the transports, Marines scheduled for later waves watched the bombardment and felt something close to pity for the Japanese defenders. Nobody could survive this. Nothing could survive this. In exactly 2 hours and 45 minutes, they would learn how wrong that assumption was. 0830 hours. The bombardment lifted. An eerie silence settled over the fleet, broken only by the sound of landing craft engines and the voice of the beach control officers on radios. In the transports, Marines descended cargo nets into waiting LVTs, the amphibious tractors that would carry them ashore. Private Howell clambered down the net, weighted down by 85 pounds of equipment, praying he wouldn't slip and fall into the gap between ship and landing craft where the Pacific could crush him. He dropped into the LVT, found a spot on the bench seat, sat shoulder to shoulder with 19 other Marines. The vehicle was cramped, smelled of diesel fuel and vomit. Someone always got seasick on the run to shore. Through the open rear hatch, Howell could see Iwo Jima, maybe 3 miles distant. Black smoke obscured parts of the island. Mount Suribachi looked like a volcano erupting, though the smoke was from naval shells, not lava. The LVT's engine roared, the vehicle lurched forward, and they began the run to shore. From the air, the invasion looked like clockwork precision. 133 waves of landing craft formed perfect lines, extending from transport ships to the beach, a 3-mile-long assembly line delivering Marines to war. The first wave, 68 LVTs carrying 1,360 Marines hit the beach at precisely 08:59, 1 minute ahead of schedule. They'd crossed 7,500 yards of ocean in 23 minutes, survived without a shot being fired, touched down on beaches designated green, red, yellow, and blue. The ramps dropped. Marines poured out onto black volcanic sand. Howell's first thought was that the sand was strange, not like beach sand, more like black powder that shifted under his boots. His second thought was that something was wrong. There should be gunfire. Every previous landing had been met with immediate fire. Here, nothing. Silence except for LVT engines and Marines shouting to each other. Howell ran 20 yards up the beach toward the terraces, volcanic sand embankments 15 feet high that looked like walls. The sand gave way under his feet like loose coffee grounds. He'd run 3 steps and sink back 2. Behind him, more LVTs were landing, disgorging troops. Hundreds of Marines on the beach now. Thousands. Still no firing. 09:15 hours. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Suribachi, 75 feet underground in his command bunker, listened to reports from observation posts. Radio operator Lieutenant Fujita was calm, precise. All beaches now covered with American troops and vehicles. Estimate 30,000 men ashore. Landing craft still approaching. They are congested on the beaches. Kuribayashi nodded. The Americans had done exactly what he'd predicted, landed en masse, pushed inland toward objectives, concentrated their forces on narrow beachheads. The beaches were crowded with men, equipment, vehicles, landing craft. Marines were struggling up the volcanic sand terraces, bunching up at choke points. Perfect. Kuribayashi lifted his radio handset. His order was brief. Commence firing. Across Iwo Jima, 300 Japanese artillery pieces, mortars, and rockets opened fire simultaneously. The Marines' quiet landing disappeared in an instant. Hell arrived on schedule. The Japanese fire was nothing like previous battles. This wasn't random shooting or panicked defensive fire. This was mathematically precise, pre-plotted artillery barrages, hitting coordinates calculated months in advance. High explosive shells from 150mm howitzers bracketed the beaches. Mortar rounds 81mm and 120mm fell in rippling patterns, each explosion throwing volcanic sand and shrapnel across 50-foot radius. Rockets fired from launchers hidden in caves, arced overhead, and detonated on landing craft still approaching shore. Marines trying to climb the sand terraces found themselves caught in interlocking machine gun fire from bunkers. They couldn't see positions dug into the terraces themselves, firing ports mere slits in volcanic rock. Within 10 minutes, the beaches transformed from organized landing to chaos. Bodies sprawled on black sand, destroyed vehicles burned, wounded men screamed for corpsmen. Landing craft trying to retreat ran into waves still approaching. The congestion became catastrophic. Private Howell was 30 yards inland when the barrage started. He heard the whistle of incoming shells sound every combat veteran learns to recognize instantly and threw himself flat. The shell hit 15 feet away. The explosion lifted him and slammed him down. His ears rang. He couldn't hear anything except a high-pitched whine. He raised his head. Where Sergeant Mitchell had been standing was now a crater. Mitchell's body was 10 feet away, or part of it was. Howell vomited into his helmet. A corporal grabbed him, shouting something Howell couldn't hear. The corporal was pointing forward, toward the terraces. Move. Get off the beach. Find cover. Howell stumbled forward, legs shaking, slipping in the volcanic sand, falling, crawling, standing again. Everywhere Marines were moving forward because staying on the beach meant dying. The training had been clear. Don't stop. Don't bunch up. Advance inland. Find cover. Return fire. Except there was nothing to return fire at. The enemy was invisible. By 1000 hours, the situation reports reaching Admiral Turner on the command ship were uniformly grim. Casualties were mounting faster than any previous operation. Beach control had broken down, destroyed vehicles, blocked lanes. Landing craft couldn't get to shore or couldn't leave. Equipment was piling up in killing zones. Worst, the advance had stalled. Marines had pushed maybe 700 yards inland at the deepest point of penetration. They'd captured the southern edge of Airfield No. 1, the first objective, but at horrific cost. Artillery and mortar fire continued without pause. Any vehicle that moved drew immediate fire from hidden positions. Flamethrower teams trying to assault bunkers were being cut down by snipers. The situation wasn't just difficult, it was unprecedented. In every previous battle, overwhelming American firepower had suppressed Japanese defenders enough to allow Marines to advance. Here, Japanese positions remained operational despite naval bombardment, emerged from cover to fire, then disappeared before counter-battery fire could arrive. The afternoon grew worse. Suribachi ordered artillery to shift from pre-plotted barrages to observer-directed fire. Japanese spotters hidden in Mount Suribachi and the northern highlands called coordinates to gun crews. A group of Marines would take cover behind a destroyed LVT. Minutes later, mortar rounds would hit that exact position. A squad would find a depression in the ground for protection. Artillery would bracket it. The Americans were being systematically hunted by observers they couldn't see, firing weapons they couldn't locate, from positions they couldn't destroy. Marine Corps doctrine emphasized aggressive offense, closing with the enemy, destroying defensive positions. But you can't close with ghosts. You can't destroy what you can't find. By mid-afternoon, units were measuring advance in yards. Some companies had pushed 100 yards inland. Others were pinned on the beaches, unable to move forward or back without taking casualties. The reserve waves faced an impossible decision. Beaches were under constant fire, but Marines ashore needed reinforcement. At 1400 hours, regimental commanders ordered reserves to land. The 28th Marine Regiment, tasked with isolating Mount Suribachi, landed on Green Beach amid artillery fire that had been landing for 5 straight hours. Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson, commanding officer of 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, led his men off an LVT, took 3 steps, and watched a mortar round kill his forward observer. Johnson grabbed the radio, called for naval gunfire on Suribachi, got confirmation that shells were on the way. 60 seconds later, shells hit Suribachi's slopes. Japanese artillery fired back from caves on Suribachi. The naval shells had hit empty rock. The Japanese guns were untouched. Johnson understood in that moment what they were facing, an enemy who had solved the fundamental problem of defensive warfare. They could fire without being targeted. They could absorb punishment without dying. This wasn't war as Doctrine described it. This was something new. By nightfall, the situation was contained but desperate. 30,000 Marines were ashore. They'd secured a beachhead roughly 4,000 yards wide and 1,000 yards deep, barely half the planned D-Day objective. More critically, they hadn't reached high ground anywhere. Mount Suribachi still dominated the southern beaches. The northern highlands still provided observation over the entire island. Japanese artillery could hit any position Americans held. The casualty count was staggering, 2,400 casualties on D-Day alone, including 548 killed. For comparison, D-Day at Normandy, with 156,000 troops landing across a 50-mile front, had suffered approximately 10,000 casualties. Iwo Jima, with 30,000 troops on 4,000 yards of front, had suffered 25% as many casualties in the same time frame. The ratio was unsustainable. At this rate, the entire amphibious corps would be destroyed before reaching the northern coast. Night on Iwo Jima brought different horrors. Marines dug foxholes in volcanic sand that kept collapsing, creating shallow scrapes that provided minimal protection. Japanese artillery continued firing sporadically, harassing fire designed to prevent sleep, to maintain psychological pressure. Infiltrators probed American lines. These weren't the banzai charges of previous battles, suicidal waves of screaming soldiers. These were small teams, 3 to 5 men, moving quietly through darkness, killing Marines in foxholes, then disappearing. Sentries fired at shadows. Nervous Marines shot at sounds. Friendly fire incidents added to the casualty count. Corpsman John Bradley, who would be photographed raising the flag on Suribachi 4 days later, spent the night moving between foxholes, treating wounded, running out of morphine, using sulfa powder and bandages and prayers. He'd trained for this. Every corpsman trained for this. But training assumed wounded could be evacuated to hospital ships. On Iwo Jima, beaches were under fire. Evacuation was slow, dangerous, sometimes impossible. Bradley treated men who would die before dawn because he couldn't get them off the island in time. In his underground command post, Suribachi reviewed the day's reports with satisfaction. His defensive plan had worked exactly as designed. The Americans had landed, advanced inland, and walked into killing zones. His artillery had fired continuously for 8 hours without being suppressed. The tunnel system had protected his garrison from naval bombardment and allowed rapid repositioning of troops. American casualties were high. His observers estimated 2,000 to 3,000, while Japanese casualties were minimal, perhaps 300 dead. The ratio was approaching his goal of 10 to 1. But Suribachi was a realist. The Americans had 70,000 men, ships offshore that could fire indefinitely, aircraft carriers providing air support, unlimited supplies. Japan had 21,000 men on an island with no possibility of reinforcement or resupply. The Americans would adapt. They would learn. The initial advantage would erode. His job was to prolong the battle as long as possible, to make every American yard cost American blood, to turn this island into a grave expensive enough that American public opinion might force negotiation instead of unconditional surrender. D-Day had exceeded his expectations. The question was whether his garrison could maintain this performance for weeks, perhaps months. Suribachi wrote in his diary that night, "First day's battle concluded successfully. Enemy landed in strength but advance limited. Casualties inflicted appear substantial. Our own losses acceptable. The battle has truly begun." Outside, in the darkness, Marines huddled in shallow foxholes, listening to the whistle of incoming shells. They'd been told this island would fall in a week. After one day, they knew that estimate was worthless. The question wasn't how long Iwo Jima would take. The question was whether any of them would survive to see it end. December 8th, 1944, 06:30 hours. Lieutenant Commander Robert Williams stood on the bridge of USS Pensacola, watching the first wave of B-24 Liberator bombers pass overhead toward Iwo Jima. The island was barely visible on the horizon, a dark smudge against the dawn sky. Williams had participated in pre-invasion bombardments at Kwajalein, Saipan, and Tinian. He understood the doctrine: pound the target with overwhelming firepower, destroy defensive positions, suppress the garrison, create conditions for successful amphibious assault. What was about to unfold over the next 72 days would be the most extensive pre-invasion bombardment in Pacific War history. It would also prove almost completely useless. By the time Marines landed on February 19th, American forces would have delivered more explosive tonnage to Iwo Jima than some European cities received during the entire war. The Japanese garrison would emerge from underground and fight with almost undiminished strength. The failure would cost thousands of American lives and force a fundamental reassessment of amphibious warfare doctrine. The air campaign began with strategic bombing runs by 7th Air Force B-24s based in the Marianas. Through December and January, waves of bombers struck Iwo Jima almost daily. The tonnage was staggering: 6,800 tons of bombs delivered over 72 consecutive days. For perspective, that's more bombs than hit most German cities during individual raids. The bombers targeted everything visible: airfields, anti-aircraft positions, suspected bunkers, supply dumps, vehicle parks, even individual buildings. Photo reconnaissance after each raid showed devastation, cratered runways, destroyed structures, burning vehicles. Intelligence officers studying the photos concluded the bombing was highly effective. Damage assessments estimated 30 to 40% of defensive positions destroyed. Japanese garrison strength reduced by attrition. Airfield facilities obliterated. The assessments were professionally prepared, analytically rigorous, and completely wrong. The bombers were destroying surface targets while the real fortress remained untouched 75 feet underground. The problem was fundamental. Aerial bombs, no matter how large, couldn't penetrate deep enough. A standard 1,000-pound general-purpose bomb penetrated maybe 10 to 15 feet into volcanic rock before detonating. The explosion would crater the surface, throw debris, create impressive-looking destruction. But 75 feet down, the shockwave dissipated into harmless vibration. Suribachi's engineers had calculated this precisely. They'd tested various depths during tunnel construction, placing instruments at different levels, then requesting American bombers be allowed to strike specific test sites. The The data confirmed that anything deeper than 40 feet was essentially safe from aerial bombardment. The Japanese garrison lived, stored supplies, positioned command posts, and maintained weapons at depths of 60 to 90 feet. The American bombs literally couldn't reach them. Meanwhile, on the surface, engineers constructed decoy positions that absorbed bombs meant for real positions. The Americans were fighting a shadow army, destroying targets that didn't matter while the real threat remained invisible. The naval bombardment, scheduled for February 16th through 18th, was supposed to finish what the bombing started. The plan called for 3 days of intensive shelling by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, the longest pre-invasion naval bombardment in Pacific War history. But there was immediate conflict between Navy and Marine leadership. Admiral William Blandy, commanding the amphibious support force, argued that 3 days was insufficient. He'd reviewed the Peleliu operation, where inadequate naval gunfire had contributed to high casualties. He requested 10 days of bombardment. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, overall amphibious commander, refused. The reasons were logistical and strategic. Ships couldn't carry ammunition for 10 days of continuous firing. Weather in the Pacific was unpredictable. The invasion schedule was fixed to coordinate with other operations. 3 days. That was the allocation. Marine General Holland Smith, commanding V Amphibious Corps, protested formally. His operations officer, Colonel David Shoup himself, a Medal of Honor recipient from Tarawa, wrote a scathing memo arguing that insufficient bombardment would result in casualties approaching 50%. The memo was ignored. 3 days remained the plan. February 16th, 0 to 700 hours. The naval bombardment began. 6 battleships positioned 7,000 yards offshore opened fire with 16-inch guns. Each shell weighed 2,700 pounds. Each gun fired 1 round every 40 seconds. The sound was apocalyptic thunder merged into continuous roar. On Iwo Jima, the surface literally shook. Volcanic dust rose in clouds. Mount Suribachi disappeared in smoke. American observers watching from ships believed nothing could survive this. They were watching the most concentrated naval gunfire in history, hitting one of the smallest targets ever bombarded. In 2 days, warships would fire 14,000 shells at an island 8 square miles in area. That's 1,750 shells per square mile. Mathematically, every 100 square yard area should have been hit by multiple shells. The island should have been obliterated. In the tunnels beneath the surface, Japanese soldiers felt the bombardment as distant thunder, slightly annoying, completely harmless. The second day brought adjustments. Forward observers and underwater demolition teams, Navy frogmen who swam to within hundreds of yards of the beaches, reported that Japanese defensive positions appeared undamaged. Bunkers that photo reconnaissance showed as destroyed were operational. Artillery pieces were firing from positions that should have been eliminated. Admiral Blandy ordered his ships closer down to 2,000 yards, close enough that Japanese coastal defense guns could engage them. USS Pensacola took 6 hits from Japanese 120mm guns, suffering 17 killed and 119 wounded. The cruiser was forced to withdraw for repairs. Other ships reported being fired on from positions that naval guns had supposedly destroyed hours earlier. The realization was dawning. The bombardment wasn't working. But by now, momentum carried the operation forward. Marines were embarked, ships were positioned, the invasion schedule was set. Stopping wasn't an option. The underwater demolition teams provided the clearest evidence of bombardment failure. On February 17th, Underwater Demolition Team 15 swam to within 300 yards of the landing beaches to scout for underwater obstacles. Traditional Japanese tactics placed extensive obstacles, steel tetrahedrons, wooden posts, barbed wire and surf zones to destroy landing craft. The UDT swimmers found almost nothing. A few scattered obstacles, nothing like the extensive defenses encountered at previous invasions. The swimmers returned and reported their findings with increasing worry. One chief petty officer told his lieutenant, "Sir, they're not defending the beaches. That means they're letting us land. That's not how enemies behave when they're scared. That's how they behave when they've got something worse waiting inland." The report went up the chain of command. It was noted, analyzed, and ultimately didn't change the plan. Perhaps the Japanese had simply failed to emplace beach obstacles. Perhaps the bombardment had destroyed them. Or perhaps, and this was the possibility, that troubled senior planners Suribachi had deliberately abandoned beach defense in favor of defense in depth. If true, Marines would land successfully, push inland, and walk into prepared killing zones beyond the reach of naval gunfire. February 18th brought the final day of bombardment. Warships fired every shell in their allowance main batteries and secondary batteries, from battleships down to destroyers. The expenditure was massive, 14,000 shells totaling thousands of tons of high explosives. Pilots flying observation missions reported the island was covered in smoke and dust, no visible activity, defenses assumed destroyed. Intelligence summaries concluded, enemy defensive capabilities severely degraded, anticipated organized resistance, light to moderate. Duration of operations, 5 to 7 days. The summaries went to every unit commander, every company commander, down to platoon leaders. Marines boarding landing craft on the morning of February 19th believed they were invading an island that had been bombed into submission. The reality was that American firepower had achieved approximately 5% degradation of Japanese combat power. 95% of the garrison was intact, waiting in tunnels, weapons clean and loaded, ammunition plentiful, orders clear. The bombardment had failed. Nobody on the American side understood how badly until Marines started dying on black sand. The post-battle analysis would be devastating in its conclusions. A Marine Corps report completed in April 1945 examined why the bombardment failed so completely. The findings centered on 3 fundamental errors. First, intelligence failure to detect the underground fortress meant fire plans targeted surface positions, while the real defensive network remained hidden. Second, doctrinal assumption that volume of fire equaled effectiveness, firing 14,000 shells at wrong targets accomplished nothing except depleting ammunition stocks. Third, underestimation of volcanic rock's protective capability. The geology of Iwo Jima made it nearly invulnerable to conventional bombardment. The report noted acidly, attempting to destroy underground positions with surface bombardment is akin to attempting to kill ants in an anthill by shooting the ground above them. One may destroy the entrance, but the colony remains intact. But there was a deeper failure, one that wouldn't be acknowledged officially for years. American military culture in 1945 was supremely confident in technological superiority and firepower dominance. The assumption was that American industrial might express through thousands of bombs and shells could solve any military problem. This worked against most enemies. Japan wasn't most enemies. Suribachi had studied American doctrine, identified its dependencies, and designed defenses specifically to negate American advantages. He couldn't match American firepower. He couldn't prevent American landings. What he could do, what he did do, was make American firepower irrelevant by going underground, and make American landings Pyrrhic by turning beaches into killing zones after naval support became ineffective. American doctrine in 1945 had no answer for an enemy who refused to play by established rules. The bombardment failed because it was fighting the wrong war. The cost of this failure would be measured in lives. Post-battle studies estimated that effective bombardment, meaning bombardment that actually degraded Japanese defensive capabilities, could have reduced American casualties by 30 to 40%. With total casualties of 26,038, that meant 7,000 to 10,000 Marines were killed or wounded because the pre-invasion bombardment failed to accomplish its objectives. 7,000 casualties because intelligence didn't detect the tunnels. 7,000 casualties because 3 days of bombardment wasn't enough. 7,000 casualties because American doctrine assumed more explosives always meant better results. The Marines who landed on February 19th paid for those assumptions with their blood. Private Howell, stumbling through volcanic sand while shells fell around him, had no idea his situation was partly caused by failures that occurred weeks before he ever saw the island. He just knew he was supposed to be invading a defeated enemy, and instead he was fighting for his life against an opponent who seemed utterly unaffected by the greatest bombardment in history. Lieutenant Commander Williams stood on USS Pensacola's damaged bridge on February 19th, watching Marines land through binoculars. Even from 7 miles offshore, he could see the beaches were under heavy fire. Smoke rose from burning vehicles. Tiny figures Marines were falling, dying. Williams had watched the bombing campaign. He'd participated in the naval bombardment. He'd genuinely believed, that American firepower had prepared the battlefield for Marine success. Now he was watching men die because that belief was wrong. Years later, in an oral history interview, Williams would say, "We threw everything we had at that island. We cratered every square yard. And then the Japanese emerged from underground and fought like the bombardment never happened. That was the moment I understood we didn't really know our enemy at all. We'd been fighting our idea of Japan, not the reality of Japan." Suribachi taught us the difference. The lesson cost 26,000 casualties. On Iwo Jima, in tunnels that American shells couldn't reach, Suribachi was teaching that lesson one dead Marine at a time. February 20th, 1945, 0800 hours. Corporal James Wright crouched in a crater that hadn't existed yesterday, trying to understand why his squad had lost 3 men in the last 4 hours without ever seeing the enemy who killed them. The crater was maybe 6 feet across, 2 feet deep, product of naval shell or aerial bomb, now repurposed as the only cover available on Iwo Jima's volcanic landscape. Wright's squad was supposed to be advancing across Airfield No. 1, the island's southern airstrip. They'd moved 50 yards in 4 hours. Every time someone tried to advance, machine gun fire came from somewhere: a cave entrance, a camouflaged bunker, a spider hole invisible until someone stepped near it. Then the fire would stop. Marines would call for tank support or artillery. By the time support arrived, the firing position was empty or sealed. When the squad tried to advance again, fire would come from a different position. It was like fighting ghosts. Except ghosts didn't kill 3 men and wound 2 more in a single morning. The American advance during the first week of Iwo Jima defied every principle of mobile warfare. In previous Pacific battles, Marines had measured territorial gains in miles per day. At Tarawa, despite horrific casualties, the island was secured in 76 hours. At Saipan, Marines advanced 3 miles on D-Day. The pattern was consistent. Overwhelming force landed, pushed inland rapidly, secured key terrain, then reduced remaining pockets. Iwo Jima broke the pattern. Day 2 saw advances measured in dozens of yards. Day 3, same. By day 5, unit commanders were reporting progress in feet, not yards. A platoon would spend 8 hours advancing 100 feet. Companies that had landed with 220 men were combat effective with 140. The casualties weren't just from direct combat. They included heat exhaustion, dehydration, combat fatigue, accidents. The volcanic sand was so unstable that men carrying wounded on stretchers would fall, injuring the wounded further. Equipment broke constantly, rifles jammed with volcanic dust, radio antennas snapped, tank tracks wore out on abrasive terrain. The island was actively hostile, and that was before considering the Japanese defenders trying to kill everyone. The airfield became the focal point of the nightmare. Airfield No. 1 was roughly 4,000 feet long, carved from volcanic sand and ash, bordered on the north by the Motoyama Plateau, and on the south by the rising ground toward Suribachi. Suribachi had positioned defensive works to create interlocking fields of fire across the entire runway. Machine gun positions on the plateau could fire down on Marines crossing the airfield. Artillery observers on Suribachi could call fire missions on any concentration of troops. Pillboxes built into the airfield's edges provided direct fire on anyone trying to advance. The result was a kill zone maybe half a mile wide, where survival was measured in minutes. Marines had to cross it because the airfield was the first objective, the terrain that would allow American aircraft to land and provide close air support. But crossing meant running through 400 yards of open ground under fire from positions that couldn't be suppressed. Companies detailed to take the airfield lost 50% casualties in the attempt. Those that succeeded in crossing found themselves pinned on the far side, unable to advance further, taking casualties from snipers and mortar fire. The Japanese defensive tactics were maddeningly effective. Suribachi had banned banzai charges, emphasizing defense from concealment and preservation of force. In practice, this meant Japanese soldiers fought differently than Americans had encountered before. A typical defensive position would be a cave or bunker with multiple exit tunnels. Marines approaching would receive fire, call for flamethrower or demolition teams. The demo team would assault the position under covering fire, place charges, detonate the entrance. Mission accomplished, or so it seemed. In reality, the Japanese defenders would retreat through tunnels before the charges detonated, wait until Marines moved past, then reoccupy the position or emerge from a different entrance behind American lines. The same position might be destroyed 3 or 4 times in a single day, yet still be operational. This drove Marine infantry to near insanity. You couldn't clear ground that wouldn't stay cleared. You couldn't advance when enemies appeared behind you. The psychological impact was profound and immediate. Marines were trained for aggressive warfare attack, overcome resistance, move forward. Iwo Jima required slow, methodical, grinding advance, where every yard was contested, every position had to be reduced multiple times, and forward progress was never secure. Combat veterans from previous campaigns found themselves disoriented. Lieutenant Harold Schreier, who would lead the patrol that raised the flag on Suribachi, later said, "I'd fought at Saipan. Saipan was hard, but it made sense. You attacked, they defended, you won or lost based on firepower and courage. Iwo Jima didn't make sense. You'd win a position, then discover you hadn't won anything because the enemy was still there, just underground. It was like fighting water. You couldn't grip it, couldn't destroy it. It just flowed around you and reformed." The psychological toll manifested in multiple ways. Some Marines became hyper-aggressive, charging positions recklessly to force resolution. They died quickly. Others became paralyzed, unable to advance because every step forward might trigger fire from an invisible enemy. They died slowly, pinned in position until artillery found them. By day 5, February 23rd, the casualty lists were creating a crisis. The V Amphibious Corps had suffered approximately 6,000 casualties, 1,500 killed, 4,500 wounded. That represented nearly 10% of the invasion force in 5 days. At this rate, the entire Corps would be combat ineffective within a month. Worse, the casualties weren't distributed evenly. Infantry companies, the units actually fighting, were being destroyed. A Marine rifle company at full strength had 242 men, 6 officers, and 236 enlisted. After 5 days on Iwo Jima, average company strength was 150 men, 38% casualties. Some companies had lost 50%. The mathematics were unsustainable. Companies couldn't function below 70% strength. Below 50%, they ceased to exist as effective combat units. Replacements were already flowing forward, fresh Marines pulled from ships, given minimal briefing, and sent directly into combat. The replacements were dying even faster than the veterans. The environment itself was attacking the Marines. Iwo Jima's volcanic sand got into everything. Rifles jammed constantly. The fine powder infiltrated actions despite careful cleaning, mixed with lubricant to form an abrasive paste that caused malfunctions. Water supplies were contaminated with sulfur, causing diarrhea and vomiting. The sulfur fumes that permeated the island irritated lungs and eyes, turning every breath into a minor act of suffering. Combat loads, 85 pounds of equipment per man, were crushing in the heat. Marines would advance 50 yards, collapse from heat exhaustion, require corpsmen to administer fluids, but water was scarce. Each Marine carried 2 canteens, 2 quarts total, supposed to last a full day. In Iwo Jima's heat, working in combat conditions, a man needed closer to a gallon per day. Dehydration became endemic. Men urinated blood. Lips cracked and bled. Heat exhaustion sent hundreds to aid stations daily, depleting combat strength as effectively as enemy fire. The nights were somehow worse than the days. Traditional Japanese tactics emphasized night attacks, banzai charges under cover of darkness, infiltration, psychological warfare. Suribachi had banned large-scale night attacks, but small-scale infiltration continued. Teams of 3 to 5 Japanese soldiers would probe American lines, looking for gaps, weak points, isolated positions. Sometimes they'd attack quick, violent assaults on foxholes, then disappearance into darkness. More often they'd observe, gathering intelligence on American positions for next day's artillery fire. Marines tried to sleep in shifts, 2 men per foxhole, 1 awake at all times. But the infiltrators were skilled. They moved silently. They wore dark uniforms that blended with volcanic rock. A Marine on watch would stare into darkness, seeing nothing, hearing only wind and distant artillery. Then a grenade would land in his foxhole. By the time he could react, the thrower was gone. The psychological effect was cumulative exhaustion combat all day, terror all night, no rest, no relief. Medical evacuation became a critical bottleneck. Corpsmen Navy medics assigned to Marine units worked miracles on Iwo Jima, but they couldn't overcome the fundamental problem. Beaches were under constant fire, making evacuation slow and dangerous. Wounded men would be stabilized by corpsmen, carried to aid stations near the beaches, then wait hours or even days for transport to hospital ships offshore. During that wait, they were still under fire. Aid stations were hit by artillery. Wounded men died from secondary wounds while waiting for evacuation. Some wounds that would have been survivable with quick treatment became fatal due to evacuation delays. Corpsman John Bradley, who'd landed on D-Day, was treating 40 to 50 casualties daily by day 5. He'd run out of morphine by day 2. His medical bag contained bandages, sulfa powder, and prayers. He'd kneel beside wounded Marines, apply pressure to sucking chest wounds, watch life fade from their eyes, move to the next casualty. By night, he'd sit in a foxhole and shake, unable to process what he'd seen, knowing he'd see it again tomorrow. The tank crews faced their own unique hell. Tanks should have provided mobile firepower and protection for advancing infantry. On Iwo Jima, tanks became targets. The volcanic sand's instability made maneuver difficult. Tanks would bog down, tracks spinning uselessly. Japanese defenders had positioned anti-tank weapons specifically to exploit this. 47mm anti-tank guns in hidden positions could penetrate Sherman tank armor at close range. Magnetic mines, portable explosives that soldiers could attach to tank hulls, turned tanks into mobile bombs. Satchel charges thrown into engine compartments caused catastrophic fires. By day 5, tank crews were requesting infantry support before moving a reversal of normal doctrine where tanks supported infantry. Even with support, losses were heavy. Of the 226 Sherman tanks that landed on Iwo Jima, 32 were destroyed in the first week. Many more were damaged. Crew casualties were horrific. A tank hit by anti-tank fire or magnetic mine would often burn, and the crew had seconds to escape before ammunition cooked off. Tankers who survived one burning vehicle rarely volunteered for another. On February 23rd, something happened that briefly gave hope to the exhausted Marines. The 28th Regiment succeeded in isolating Mount Suribachi, cutting it off from the rest of the island. A 40-man patrol led by Lieutenant Schreier climbed to the summit and planted an American flag. The moment was photographed, first a small flag, then a larger flag raised 2 hours later in Joe Rosenthal's famous image. For Americans reading newspapers back home, the flag raising symbolized imminent victory. For Marines on Iwo Jima, it meant they'd secured one objective at the cost of nearly 900 casualties. Mount Suribachi was 10% of the island's area. 90% remained, defended by Japanese forces that seemed utterly undiminished despite a week of combat. Corporal Wright, still crouched in his crater on Airfield No. 1, heard the news about Suribachi over the radio. His reaction was bitter laughter. They'd taken a mountain, and it cost 1,000 casualties. The real war was here, in the center of the island, fighting for volcanic sand that gave no cover and held no value except that the enemy wouldn't surrender it. This wasn't a battle. This was arithmetic. American lives subtracted one by one until either the Japanese ran out of bullets or Americans ran out of men. Wright looked at what remained of his squad, 5 men out of 13, and wondered which would happen first. February 23, 1945, 0800 hours. Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson stood at the base of Mount Suribachi, staring up at the 556-foot volcanic cone that had killed 300 of his Marines in 4 days. Johnson commanded 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, the unit tasked with taking Suribachi. The mountain had seemed straightforward on planning maps: isolate it from the main island, reduce the defensive positions, secure the summit. Reality had been far different. Suribachi wasn't a mountain. It was a fortress carved into volcanic rock, honeycombed with over 1,000 caves and tunnel entrances, defended by 2,000 Japanese soldiers who had no intention of dying quickly. Johnson's battalion had spent 4 days methodically destroying each position, using tactics that wouldn't be formalized for another 20 years. Small unit assaults, flamethrowers, and demolitions, coordinated fire support. The cost had been staggering 895 casualties, including 186 dead. But Suribachi was finally isolated, its defenders cut off from resupply and reinforcement. This morning, Johnson would send a patrol to the summit. If they made it, they'd plant a flag. Not because flags had tactical value, but because symbols mattered when men were dying for volcanic rock. The patrol assembled at 0830. 40 men from Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, Lieutenant Harold Schreier commanding, Sergeant Ernest Thomas as second in command, Platoon Sergeant Michael Strank, Corporal Harlan Block, PFC Ira Hayes, PFC Franklin Sousley, and 34 others. They carried rifles, demolitions, a flamethrower, radio, and one object that seemed absurd given the circumstances, an American flag, 54 inches by 28 inches, borrowed from a ship offshore. Colonel Johnson's orders were specific: climb to the summit, secure it, raise the flag. If they encountered resistance, call for support and withdraw. Nobody knew if Suribachi's summit was defended or if Japanese defenders had retreated into lower tunnels. Intelligence suggested the summit positions might be abandoned, but intelligence had been wrong about nearly everything on Iwo Jima. Schreier checked his men's equipment, nodded to Johnson, and began climbing. Below, thousands of Marines watched. After a week of dying for yards, this would be the first visible victory or the first visible disaster, if Japanese defenders were waiting at the top. The climb took 40 minutes. The slope was steep, maybe 40 degrees, in places loose volcanic rock that shifted underfoot. Schreier moved carefully, pausing every few yards to scan for enemy positions. His Marines spread out, maintaining interval, covering different approaches. They encountered destroyed bunkers, collapsed cave entrances, Japanese bodies from previous bombardments, no living enemy. At approximately 10:15, Schreier reached the summit crater, a roughly circular depression, maybe 150 feet across, surrounded by a rim of volcanic rock. The crater interior was pocked with shell craters and destroyed positions. 200 yards below, the entirety of Iwo Jima's southern beaches spread out thousands of Marines, hundreds of vehicles, ships offshore. From this height, the American invasion looked like organized ant colonies. From this height, Japanese observers had been calling artillery fire for 4 days. Securing Suribachi meant those observers were neutralized. Schreier pulled out the flag, found a length of pipe in the rubble, and called his men to help raise it. The first flag raising occurred at 10:20 hours on February 23rd. 5 Marines and 1 Navy corpsman lifted the pipe and planted it in volcanic ash. The flag caught the wind and unfurled. Below, Marines on the beaches noticed immediately. Cheering erupted. Ship whistles blew. After a week of dying, they had something to celebrate, a visible, tangible success. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal, observing from the command ship, turned to General Holland Smith and said, "The raising of that flag means a Marine Corps for the next 500 years." Forrestal was watching symbolism being created in real time. The flag proved Americans could take Japanese-held terrain. It proved sacrifice led to victory. It proved the island could be conquered. The fact that the flag represented 10% of the island while 90% remained didn't matter. People needed symbols. The flag provided one. But the first flag was small. Colonel Johnson, watching from below through binoculars, decided it should be larger, visible from across the island, undeniable in its statement. He ordered his adjutant, Lieutenant Ted Tuttle, to find a bigger flag. Tuttle contacted Ensign Alan Wood on LST 779, a landing ship that typically carried a large ensign. Wood located a flag 96 inches by 56 inches, nearly twice the size of the first flag. The flag was loaded onto a jeep and driven to Suribachi's base, then carried up the mountain by runners, including PFC René Gagnon. Meanwhile, Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal had climbed Suribachi, hoping to photograph the flag raising. He'd missed the first raising, arriving at the summit around noon. Learning a second flag was coming up and would be raised while the first flag was lowered, Rosenthal positioned himself with his speed graphic camera. What happened next would become the most reproduced photograph in history. 1200 hours. 6 men gathered around a new pipe containing the larger flag. Sergeant Michael Strank, Corporal Harlan Block, PFC Franklin Sousley, PFC Ira Hayes, PFC Renee Gagnon, and Navy Corpsman John Bradley. The assignment was random. These men happened to be near the flagpole when the call for help came. They weren't chosen for their heroism or appearance. They were chosen by proximity and chance. Rosenthal, 20 yards away, raised his camera to eye level. He had one plate loaded, one shot, because he'd taken photos all morning and was conserving film. The 6 men lifted the pole together. The weight was substantial, maybe 200 pounds of pipe and flag. They struggled to raise it upright, feet bracing against volcanic rock, bodies straining with effort. Rosenthal triggered the shutter at 1/400th of a second. The photo captured the flag at roughly 45 degrees, still being raised, 6 figures silhouetted against a sky, bodies in motion suggesting collective effort and strength. Rosenthal didn't realize he'd captured anything special. He lowered his camera, took other photos of Marines celebrating, then descended the mountain to file his images. The photograph took days to reach America. Rosenthal's film was flown to Guam, developed, transmitted via radio wire photo to San Francisco, distributed to newspapers. It appeared on front pages across America on February 25th, 2 days after it was taken. The response was instantaneous and overwhelming. The image seemed to capture everything Americans wanted to believe about the war: collective effort, inevitable victory, sacrifice leading to triumph. Within days, the photo was being reprinted in magazines, posters, war bond advertisements. Within weeks, it was the most famous photograph of the war. Within months, it was being discussed for the Pulitzer Prize, which it would win in 1946. The 6 flag raisers became celebrities before they knew they'd been photographed. 3 of them, Strank, Block, and Sousley, would be killed on Iwo Jima within days, never knowing their image had become iconic. The 3 survivors, Hayes, Gagnon, and Bradley, would be pulled from combat, sent back to America, and forced to perform the role of heroes on war bond tours while their friends continued dying on volcanic rock. But the photograph's power created distortions. Americans looking at newspapers saw the flag raising and assumed Iwo Jima was nearly won. Marines on the island knew better. Suribachi represented maybe 1 square mile of an 8-square-mile island. The 28th Marines had suffered 895 casualties, taking it roughly 40% of the regiment's strength. If the rest of the island cost proportionally, the operation would require 20,000 casualties. That estimate would prove optimistic. The flag raising occurred on day 5 of a battle that would last 36 days. More than 70% of American casualties were still ahead. The iconic image froze a moment of success in the middle of ongoing catastrophe, and that freeze frame became how America remembered Iwo Jima as a triumph, not a slaughter. The Japanese response to the flag raising was instructive. Suribachi received reports that Suribachi had fallen and American flag was flying from the summit. His response, recorded in his diary, Suribachi's loss was inevitable. The position was tactically isolated, garrison was small, terrain favored attackers. The Americans paid acceptable price, approximately 900 casualties for 1,000 defenders. The exchange ratio is less favorable than northern sectors, where terrain advantages lie with us. Primary battle continues in the north. For Suribachi, Suribachi was a sacrifice position useful for its observation capabilities and psychological impact on Americans, but not essential to his defensive strategy. He'd always expected to lose it. What mattered was how much it cost the Americans and how long it delayed their advance northward. By that metric, Suribachi had succeeded. The 28th Marines who took it were temporarily combat ineffective, requiring days to reorganize before rejoining the fight in the north. The flag itself flew over Suribachi for the duration of the battle, 31 more days after being raised. Marines passing through southern Iwo Jima would look up and see it, a reminder of what had been achieved and what had been lost. By battle's end, the battalion that raised the flag, 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, would suffer total casualties exceeding 90%. Almost every man who landed on D-Day was killed or wounded. The survivors, including Hayes and Bradley, carried scars that never healed. Hayes, a Pima Indian from Arizona, struggled with alcoholism and fame, dying at age 32. Bradley never discussed Iwo Jima with his family. keeping his memories locked away until his death in 1994. Gagnon lived until 2004, the last surviving flag raiser, giving interviews that became increasingly bitter about how the photograph had turned a moment of collective effort into individual celebrity, while the real heroes, the ones who died, were forgotten. On February 25th, 2 days after the flag raising, Lieutenant Colonel Johnson was killed by artillery fire while directing an assault on a Japanese position. He never learned that his decision to send a second, larger flag up Suribachi had created the most famous military photograph in history. He was buried at sea, one of 6,821 Americans who would die taking an island most Americans couldn't locate on a map before February 1945. The flag he ordered raised became a symbol of American military power, displayed at recruiting stations and war memorials for decades. But symbols are dangerous. They simplify. They clean up. They make war look like flag raisings instead of what it actually is. Young men dying in volcanic sand for objectives that might be forgotten within a generation. The Marines who raised that flag understood this. America didn't. The photograph became larger than the battle, the symbol more important than the reality. And while America celebrated a flag on a mountain, Marines were still dying in volcanic ash, grinding northward yard by bloody yard, learning that Suribachi was just the beginning. March 2nd, 1945, 1400 hours. Sergeant Frank Caldwell stood at the entrance to what his combat engineers estimated was a 3-level tunnel complex beneath Airfield No. 2. The entrance was maybe 4 feet high, 3 feet wide, a black hole carved into volcanic rock that exhaled hot air reeking of sulfur and something worse, something organic and rotting. Caldwell's demolition team had been tasked with clearing this position after a Marine squad reported taking fire from the cave, calling for artillery support, watching shells hit the hillside, then receiving fire from the same position 20 minutes later. The pattern was becoming familiar and maddening. Japanese defenders would fire, retreat into tunnels before counter-battery arrived, wait, then reoccupy positions. The only solution was going into the tunnels. Caldwell checked his equipment: flashlight, .45 caliber pistol, grenades, combat knife. His flamethrower operator, PFC Martinez, carried the M22 flamethrower, 68 pounds of napalm fuel and nitrogen propellant. Behind them, 4 riflemen provided security. They were about to enter a 3-dimensional battlefield, where every advantage belonged to the enemy. American Doctrine had nothing to say about this. They were inventing tunnel warfare in real time. The tunnel systems beneath Iwo Jima were military engineering marvels that American forces were completely unprepared to fight in. Kuribayashi's 11 miles of tunnels weren't simple, linear passages. They were complex, 3-dimensional networks with multiple levels, interconnected chambers, hidden entrances, and clever defensive features. A typical major complex might have a main entrance large enough for troops to enter in formation, connected to smaller passages that branched and rejoined, vertical shafts connecting different levels, and dozens of small exits disguised as natural volcanic vents. Inside, the Japanese had carved chambers for specific purposes: ammunition, storage, command posts, sleeping quarters, aid stations, even small shrines. Some chambers were large enough to hold artillery pieces, with elaborate systems of rails and pulleys to move guns to firing positions, then pull them back into protection. The tunnel walls weren't rough-hewn rock. They were smoothed, sometimes reinforced with timber or concrete, with ventilation shafts and electrical wiring for lights and communications. These weren't crude foxholes. They were underground fortresses designed by engineers who understood Americans would eventually have to enter them. Caldwell's first step into the tunnel was sensory overload. The temperature jumped 20 degrees immediately from 90 degrees outside to 110 inside. The air was thick, humid, tasted of sulfur and smoke. His flashlight beam revealed a passage descending at maybe 15 degrees, carved through volcanic rock, walls glistening with moisture. The passage was narrow enough that Martinez's flamethrower scraped both walls. Every 10 feet, the tunnel would angle slightly, preventing anyone outside from seeing deeper than 30 feet in. Caldwell understood this was deliberate. Defenders could fire from around corners and retreat before attackers could return fire effectively. He moved slowly, pistol raised, listening. Somewhere deeper in the complex, he could hear voices speaking Japanese, distant but distinct. How far? 20 feet? 50? Sound behaved strangely in tunnels. Distance and direction became unreliable. Caldwell hand-signaled his team to halt. They needed a different approach. Clearing this with small arms would get them killed. Martinez understood without being told. He moved forward, positioning the flamethrower's nozzle aimed down the tunnel. Caldwell nodded. Martinez triggered the igniter. The physics of flamethrowers in confined spaces are horrific. In open air, burning napalm creates a stream of fire 40 to 50 feet long, hot enough to melt steel, lethal within a 20-foot radius. In a tunnel, the effects are magnified catastrophically. The burning napalm doesn't just create fire, it creates a pressure wave of superheated air traveling at high velocity. The fire consumes oxygen, creating partial vacuum that sucks fresh air from behind the flamethrower team, feeding the flames further. Anyone in the tunnel ahead dies from multiple causes simultaneously: burning, oxygen deprivation, pressure trauma, toxic fume inhalation. It's not combat. It's applied physics, resulting in inescapable death. Martinez fired for 6 seconds, half his fuel load filling the tunnel with flame. The roar was deafening. Heat washed back over Caldwell's team despite being behind the weapon. The Japanese voices stopped screaming after maybe 4 seconds. When the flames cleared, the tunnel walls glowed red hot. Bodies or pieces of bodies lay in blackened heaps. The smell was beyond description. Caldwell's team moved forward, stepping over remains, pushing deeper into the complex. This was the new reality of Iwo Jima. There was no glory here, just necessary horror. The evolution of tunnel fighting tactics on Iwo Jima happened rapidly, driven by necessity and casualties. Early attempts to clear tunnels used grenades and small arms. Marines would throw grenades into entrances, wait for explosions, then enter firing. This resulted in high casualties when Japanese defenders in deeper chambers survived and killed the entering Marines. The next evolution added demolitions. Place satchel charges at entrances, detonate, collapse the tunnel. This worked but was inefficient. Many tunnels had multiple entrances, and collapsing one just sealed part of the complex. The Japanese would simply use other exits. By late February, Marines had developed the corkscrew and blowtorch technique. Flamethrowers to clear the initial tunnel sections, demolition charges to collapse rear areas, then seal all known entrances with bulldozers and explosives. Even this wasn't perfect. Some complexes were so extensive that Marines sealed dozens of entrances only to have Japanese emerge from exits nobody had discovered. The only reliable method was systematic. Map every entrance, clear every chamber, seal every exit. It took days per complex. Days during which Marines died, clearing rock underground, while battles raged on the surface. The psychological cost of tunnel fighting was immense and largely unacknowledged at the time. Combat on the surface, however deadly, occurred in daylight with visible enemies and clear objectives. Tunnel fighting occurred in darkness, against enemies who might be 10 feet away or might be in the next chamber, with the ever-present risk of cave-ins, oxygen depletion, or getting lost in passages that all looked identical. Flamethrower operators bore the worst of it. PFC Martinez, after his first tunnel clearance, sat outside the entrance for 20 minutes vomiting. He'd killed at least a dozen men in 6 seconds. He'd heard them scream. He could smell their burning flesh on his uniform. That night, he told Caldwell he couldn't do it again. Caldwell's response was blunt. "You can do it again, or we all die trying without you. Your choice." Martinez did it again the next day, and the day after. By battle's end, he'd cleared 17 tunnel complexes, killing perhaps 200 Japanese soldiers. He survived Iwo Jima, returned to America, and never spoke about the island to anyone. When he died in 1997, his family found his war memorabilia in a box in the attic. Medals, photographs, letters. No mention of Iwo Jima, no mention of tunnels. Some experiences are too dark to share. The Japanese defenders in the tunnels fought with desperate innovation. Traditional tactics emphasized close combat with bayonets and swords. In tunnels, this was suicidal against American shotguns and automatic weapons. Instead, Japanese soldiers developed their own techniques. Grenades thrown around corners, tripwires connected to explosives, false walls concealing defenders, collapsed sections of tunnel that could be reopened to allow flanking attacks. Some defenders would retreat deeper into complexes when Americans entered, wait until the assault team was fully committed, then trigger prepared demolitions to collapse the tunnel behind them. This trapped the American team inside with no retreat route. The results were predictable. Several demolition teams disappeared into tunnel complexes and were never seen again. Days later, Marines sealing entrances would find their remains killed by cave-ins, suffocation, or Japanese ambush. The casualty ratio in tunnel fighting was perhaps 3-1, favoring defenders, despite American firepower advantages. A 6-man demolition team might kill 20 Japanese soldiers while clearing a complex, but lose 2 of their own. Over hundreds of complexes, the casualties mounted horrifically. The equipment evolved through trial and error. Standard infantry rifles, M1 Garens, were too long and cumbersome for tunnel fighting. Marines discovered that shotguns, pistols, and M1 carbines worked better in confined spaces. Flamethrowers were essential but temperamental. The napalm fuel was corrosive and volatile. The ignition systems frequently failed in humid conditions, and operators needed constant maintenance. Flashlights were critical, but batteries died quickly, and the lights made excellent targets for Japanese defenders. Some Marines started using candles, slower burning, less bright, but reliable. Communications were almost impossible. Radio signals couldn't penetrate volcanic rock. Telephone wire could be strung through tunnels, but Japanese defenders would cut it. Hand signals worked only in line of sight. The result was that tunnel fighting teams operated independently once they entered, cut off from support, making tactical decisions in darkness with incomplete information. Small unit leadership became everything. A competent sergeant could successfully clear a complex. An incompetent one could get his entire team killed. By mid-March, the Marines had cleared hundreds of tunnel complexes but hadn't eliminated the threat. Some tunnel systems were simply too extensive to clear completely. The command complex in the northern sector, Kuribayashi's headquarters, was eventually bypassed rather than assaulted because intelligence estimated it would take weeks to clear and cost hundreds of casualties. Instead, Marines sealed the main entrances, posted guards, and moved on. The Japanese garrison inside, perhaps 300 soldiers, remained alive in darkness for days, even weeks. Some eventually starved or suffocated. Some committed suicide. A few dug their way out through emergency exits and continued fighting. The last confirmed Japanese soldier killed in combat on Iwo Jima died on March 26th, but that wasn't the last Japanese soldier on Iwo Jima. That distinction went to Private Yamakaze Kufuku and Corporal Matsudo, who emerged from a northern tunnel in January 1949, 4 years after the battle ended, and surrendered to American occupation forces. They'd survived in the tunnels, eating stored rations, drinking condensed water, living in darkness because they didn't know the war had ended or couldn't accept that it had. The legacy of Iwo Jima's tunnel warfare extended far beyond the island. American military planners studying the battle concluded that tunnel defenses represented a fundamental challenge to conventional warfare doctrine. The reports noted, traditional advantages of firepower, mobility, and air superiority are negated by subterranean defense. Attacking forces must enter enemy-dominated terrain where numerical superiority and technological advantages are minimized. Casualties are inevitable and proportional to the extent of tunnel networks. These lessons influenced planning for future operations. Okinawa's defenses included extensive tunnel systems modeled on Iwo Jima. Post-war, the Viet Cong and Vietnam would use tunnel networks even more extensively, creating complexes at Kyu Chi and elsewhere that confounded American forces for years. The Israel Defense Forces studied Iwo Jima when developing tactics for tunnel warfare against Hamas and Hezbollah. Modern urban warfare doctrine, clearing buildings room by room, using special breaching charges. Coordinating small units traces lineage directly to lessons learned in Iwo Jima's volcanic tunnels. Sergeant Caldwell survived 17 tunnel clearances, earning a Silver Star for actions he never discussed. Years later, in an oral history interview, he was asked what the worst part of tunnel fighting was. His answer was immediate. The worst part wasn't the danger. Marines accept danger. The worst part was that you had to become something less than human to do it effectively. You had to turn off the part of your brain that recognizes the enemy as people. Because if you thought about the fact that you're burning men alive in confined spaces where they can't escape, you couldn't pull the trigger, so you stopped thinking. You became a machine that entered darkness, burned everything that moved, and exited. Then, at night, alone in your foxhole, the humanity would come back. And you'd have to process what the machine had done during the day. Some guys couldn't reconcile it. They'd either break down or shut down completely. I was in the shutdown category. I functioned on Iwo Jima, but I think part of me died in those tunnels, the part that believed war had rules, or honor, or meaning. That part burned away, like the men I killed underground. The tunnels of Iwo Jima weren't just tactical challenges, they were moral abysses, where young men were forced to commit necessary atrocities, then live with the consequences for decades afterward. March 7th, 1945, 0900 hours. Private Robert Morrison was 19 years old, had completed 6 weeks of basic training at Camp Pendleton, and was about to land on Iwo Jima with absolutely no idea what he was walking into. The transport ship LST-542 had left Pearl Harbor 4 days ago, carrying 3,000 replacement Marines, fresh troops, to replace casualties that had exceeded every projection. Morrison stood on deck, watching the island approach, trying to match what he saw with what he'd been told during the 30-minute briefing on the ship. The briefing had been basic: heavy fighting, follow orders, don't bunch up. Nobody had explained that the Black Sand Beach was still under sporadic artillery fire 17 days after D-Day. Nobody had mentioned that Morrison's predecessors in Fox Company, 2nd Battalion, 23rd Marines, had suffered 70% casualties. Nobody had prepared him for the smell, sulfur, and rotting flesh, and burned equipment that hit when the landing ramp dropped. Morrison stepped onto volcanic sand, weighted by his 85-pound combat load, and immediately understood that his training had been theoretical preparation for a reality that defied theory. The replacement system on Iwo Jima was driven by mathematics that bordered on catastrophic. The amphibious corps had landed with 70,647 Marines on February 19th. By March 1st day, 11 casualties exceeded 12,000, 3,000 killed, 9,000 wounded. That represented 17% of the invasion force. Infantry companies, which did the actual fighting, were suffering 40 to 60% casualties. Some companies had effectively ceased to exist as organized units. The Marine Corps solution was massive influx of replacements. 9,000 fresh Marines cycled to Iwo Jima between March 1st and March 20th. These weren't trained combat veterans. They were recent boot camp graduates, many with 8 weeks or less of training, most having never fired a weapon in combat. They were being thrown into the most intense infantry combat in Marine Corps history, with minimal preparation because there was no alternative. The existing units were dissolving. Without replacements, the offensive would stall. The replacement system was sustaining the battle. It was also feeding young men with inadequate training into a meat grinder. The training deficit was profound and immediately apparent. Morrison's basic training had covered rifle marksmanship, close order drill, physical fitness, and basic field craft. He'd spent 6 weeks learning to shoot straight, march in formation, and follow orders. He hadn't trained extensively in small unit tactics, hadn't practiced coordinated assaults, hadn't learned to identify covered approaches or call for artillery support. Most critically, he hadn't been psychologically conditioned for sustained combat. Boot camp instructors had yelled at him and created stress, but that wasn't combat. Combat was confusion, terror, exhaustion, and trauma sustained for days without relief. Experienced Marines had learned coping mechanisms through previous battles. Morrison had none. Within hours of landing, he was attached to 2nd Squad, Fox Company introduced to 5 Marines who looked at him with expressions mixing pity and resignation. The squad leader, Corporal Hayes, was 21 years old but looked 40. Hayes's briefing was brutally concise. Stay close. Watch what we do. When we move, you move. When we stop, you find cover. Don't stand up, don't bunch up, don't fire unless you have a target. Questions? Morrison had 1,000 questions. Hayes was already walking away. The first 72 hours for replacements were statistically the most dangerous period. Studies conducted after the battle showed that replacement Marines had 60% casualty rates in their first 3 days, dropping to 30% after the initial period. The reasons were multiple. Inexperience led to mistakes like standing in exposed positions or failing to identify cover. Lack of unit cohesion meant experienced Marines couldn't effectively protect new arrivals. Psychological shock of combat often caused freezing or panic, and Japanese defenders seemed able to identify and target new troops. Some of this was observable. Experienced Marines moved differently, used terrain better, didn't make rookie mistakes. Some might have been coincidence. But every veteran on Iwo Jima knew the pattern. Replacements died fast. Morrison's first combat action occurred on March 8th, his second day on the island. Second Squad was tasked with clearing a pillbox that had been firing on 3rd Platoon. The approach required crossing 50 yards of open ground under potential observation from Japanese positions on high ground. Hayes assigned Morrison to 3rd position in the movement order behind 2 experienced Marines, ahead of 2 more. The reasoning was sound. Put the replacement where he could see what to do, but wouldn't be point man if things went wrong. The assault was textbook infantry tactics, executed under fire. 1st Marine advanced in short rushes, run 5 seconds, drop prone, cover other Marines advancing. 2nd Marine moved using same technique. Morrison's turn. Hayes shouted, "Move!" Morrison ran. Terror gave him speed. His 85-pound load felt like it weighed nothing. He ran hard for 5 seconds, threw himself flat behind a low ridge of volcanic rock. Chest heaving, hands shaking, rifle clutch so tight his knuckles were white. Behind him, 4th Marine was moving. Then 5th. The pillbox open-fire machine gun sounded like Japanese Type 96, 7.7mm rounds that made distinctive cracking sounds when they passed overhead. Morrison pressed himself into volcanic ash like he could merge with it. Hayes was shouting for the bazooka team. 2 Marines moved forward with the M1A1 bazooka, 1 carrying the weapon, 1 carrying rockets. They reached a position 20 yards from the pillbox, loaded a high explosive round, fired. The rocket hit the pillbox's firing slit, detonated inside. The machine gun stopped. Hayes ran forward, throwing grenades through the opening. Explosions, silence. Hayes turned and shouted, "Clear! Move up!" Morrison stood and ran forward on legs that barely worked. His first combat action had lasted maybe 90 seconds. He hadn't fired his weapon, he hadn't contributed to the assault, but he'd survived. That was something. The unit cohesion problem was severe and worsening as casualties mounted. Military effectiveness depends heavily on small unit cohesion, the bonds between squad members that create trust, communication, and coordinated action. These bonds develop through training and shared experience. On Iwo Jima, original units were being destroyed faster than cohesion could develop among replacements. 2nd Squad, Fox Company had landed on D-Day with 13 men commanded by Sergeant William Mitchell, the Tarawa veteran who'd worried about the island. By March 8th, Mitchell was dead, killed by artillery on March 2nd. Of the original 13, 5 were dead, 4 were wounded and evacuated, 3 remained. The squad had been brought back to strength with replacements Morrison and 4 others. The resulting unit was a squad in name only. The 3 veterans knew each other, trusted each other, worked together smoothly. The 5 replacements were strangers to everyone, including each other. The result was predictable. The veterans took risks because they knew their buddies would cover them. Replacements hesitated because they didn't trust men they'd just met. Coordination suffered. Casualties increased. Leadership attrition compounded every problem. In peacetime, Marine squad leaders were typically corporals with 3 to 5 years of experience. Platoon sergeants had 8 to 12 years. Company commanders were captains with extensive training. On Iwo Jima, the life expectancy of these leadership positions was measured in days. Squad leaders lasted maybe a week before being killed or wounded. Platoon sergeants fared slightly better. Company commanders averaged 10 days. When leaders became casualties, they were replaced by whoever survived. A private with initiative might become acting squad leader. A corporal might take over a platoon. By mid-March, Fox Company's 3rd Platoon was commanded by a corporal who'd been a rifleman on D-Day. He'd been promoted 3 times as his superiors died. He was 20 years old, had 6 weeks of combat experience, and was responsible for 40 Marines, including a dozen replacements he'd met 2 days earlier. The system was straining beyond designed capacity. The psychological impact on replacements was catastrophic and largely unrecognized by military medicine in 1945. Combat fatigue, what would later be called PTSD, was understood as something that developed after prolonged combat exposure. Replacements were experiencing psychological trauma almost immediately. Morrison's first week included witnessing 3 squad members killed by artillery, participating in 2 major assaults that failed with heavy casualties, enduring near-continuous artillery and mortar fire, sleeping less than 4 hours per day, and eating maybe 1 meal daily because fear suppressed appetite. By day 7, he was experiencing symptoms that combat psychiatrists wouldn't formally identify for another decade: hypervigilance, emotional numbing, intrusive memories, dissociation. During firefights, Morrison would observe himself as if from outside his body, watching his hands reload his rifle, hearing himself shout warnings, feeling detached from his own actions. At night, in fitful sleep, he'd relive attacks in recursive loops where every outcome led to death. During the day, he'd startle at sudden sounds, aim his rifle at shadows, struggle to distinguish present danger from remembered trauma. The survival strategies developed by replacements were varied and often contrary to training. Some replacements became hyper-aggressive, seeking combat, taking risks, volunteering for dangerous assignments. The psychology was simple. If death was inevitable, better to control how it happened than wait passively. These Marines often died within days, but died acting rather than cowering. Other replacements did the opposite, becoming extremely cautious, minimizing exposure, never volunteering, doing exactly what ordered but nothing extra. They survived longer, but were less effective. A few replacements, perhaps 5%, simply broke. They'd stop functioning under fire, freezing, weeping, becoming catatonic. These men were classified as combat fatigue casualties and evacuated. Most replacements fell somewhere in the middle, terrified but functional, traumatized but operational, dying inside while killing outside. Morrison was in this category. By March 15th, his 7th day on Iwo Jima, he'd stopped thinking of himself as Robert Morrison from Indiana, who liked baseball and wanted to be a teacher. He was Replacement 3, the designation used on casualty rosters. His identity had dissolved into his function. He was a rifle, a pair of hands, a set of eyes scanning for enemy positions. The person he'd been was gone, maybe temporarily, maybe permanently. The replacement flow sustained the battle, but at staggering human cost. Of the 9,000 replacement Marines sent to Iwo Jima, approximately 3,000 became casualties, 33%. This was actually lower than the 45% casualty rate for original invasion forces, but that statistic was misleading. Replacements arrived throughout March, meaning many experienced less than 2 weeks of combat. Had they been present for the entire battle, their casualty rate would have exceeded 50%. The survivors carried trauma that manifested in multiple ways. Some became career Marines, finding purpose in military structure and camaraderie. Others struggled with civilian life, unable to adjust to peacetime routines after experiencing Iwo Jima's intensity. A few exact numbers, unknown, committed suicide in the years following the war. The replacement system on Iwo Jima succeeded in its immediate objective, providing enough bodies to sustain the offensive until the island was secured. But it created a generation of traumatized young men who'd been thrown into combat with minimal preparation and expected to function like veterans. Morrison survived Iwo Jima, returned to Indiana, became a teacher as he'd planned. He taught for 42 years and by all accounts was good at his job, but he never married, never had close friends, and never discussed the war. When he died in 2003, his sister found a box in his closet containing his dress uniform, medals, and a single photograph. 2nd Squad, Fox Company, taken on March 15, 1945. Morrison had circled faces his fellow replacements. Below each circle, he'd written dates. 3 showed dates in March, 45. They'd been killed within days of the photo. The other 2 showed dates in the 1950s. 1, suicide. 1 car accident that Morrison had noted, drunk driving suicide. Below the photo, Morrison had written a single sentence. We were children, sent to fight a war we didn't understand. Some of us survived. None of us came home. February 23rd, 1945, 1100 hours. Corporal Herschel Woody Williams crouched behind a disabled Sherman tank, weighing his options with the cold calculation of a man who'd already accepted he was probably going to die today. Williams was a flamethrower operator with 21st Marines, 3rd Marine Division. For 4 hours, his company had been pinned down by fire from 7 reinforced concrete pillboxes, positioned to provide interlocking fields of fire across the approach to Airfield No. 2. Every attempt to advance had been repulsed. Tank assaults had failed 2 Shermans, destroyed by anti-tank fire, 1 disabled by magnetic mine. Infantry assaults had failed with heavy casualties. Artillery and naval gunfire had pounded the positions for 30 minutes, with no visible effect. The pillboxes were built into volcanic rock, with steel-reinforced concrete walls 5 feet thick. Standard weapons couldn't touch them. Flamethrowers could. Williams had the flamethrower. That meant Williams had the job. He turned to his demolition team, 4 riflemen assigned to cover him, and laid out the plan. It wasn't complex. He'd advance toward the first pillbox under covering fire. He'd burn it out. Then he'd move to the second pillbox. Then the third. He'd continue until all 7 were destroyed or he was dead. The demolition team nodded. Nobody spoke. There was nothing to say. Williams checked his M22 flamethrower. 70 pounds, including fuel, nitrogen propellant, ignition system. 8 to 10 seconds of firing time. Effective range 40 feet. Beyond 40 feet, the burning napalm dispersed and became less effective. Inside 40 feet, it was utterly lethal. Williams had used flamethrowers in training. He'd never fired one in combat. He was about to learn why flamethrower operators had the highest casualty rate of any combat specialty. The tactical doctrine for flamethrower employment was clear in training manuals, but nearly impossible to execute in combat. The flamethrower operator was supposed to advance with rifle support, get within 40 feet of a target, expose himself long enough to fire 3 to 5 seconds, then retreat to cover while the burning position was destroyed. The reality on Iwo Jima was that Japanese defenders recognized flamethrower operators instantly. The M22 wasn't subtle, a large cylindrical tank on the operator's back, hose and nozzle assembly, distinctive profile. Japanese snipers and machine gunners prioritized flamethrower operators above all other targets because flamethrowers were the only weapons that reliably destroyed pillboxes and bunkers. A man carrying a flamethrower in combat had a life expectancy measured in minutes. Williams understood this. So did his covering team. They'd trained together for 6 months. They trusted each other. That trust was about to be tested against reality. Williams moved first. He ran low, zigzagging across volcanic sand, heading for a depression in the ground, maybe 30 yards from the first pillbox. Machine gun fire kicked up sand around his feet. A bullet hit his flamethrower tank with a metallic clang that made his heart stop if the tank was punctured. Escaping fuel would ignite, and he'd burn alive. But the tank held. Williams dove into the depression, gasping for breath, checking his equipment. The impact had dented the tank, but hadn't punctured it. Behind him, his covering team was firing at the pillbox's observation slits, trying to force Japanese defenders to take cover. Williams waited 10 seconds for the covering fire to build, then ran again. 20 yards, 15 yards, 10 yards. At 40 feet, he stopped, raised the nozzle, and triggered the igniter. The flamethrower roared. Burning napalm gasoline, thickened with napalm gel, sprayed from the nozzle in a bright orange stream. The stream hit the pillbox's firing slit and flooded inside. Screams erupted from inside the pillbox. Williams held the trigger for 5 seconds, expending half his fuel load. When he released the trigger, the screaming had stopped. Black smoke poured from the pillbox. Williams turned and ran toward the second pillbox. The action that followed would earn Williams the Medal of Honor, but the official citation wouldn't capture the sustained horror of what he did. For 4 hours, Williams cleared 7 pillboxes using the last flamethrower on Iwo Jima after all others had been destroyed or disabled. He'd advance, fire, retreat, reload from fuel canisters brought forward by Marines crawling through sand, then advance again. Japanese defenders shot at him constantly. Bullets hit his flamethrower tank repeatedly, each impact a potential death sentence if the tank breached. His covering team took casualties, 2 killed, 1 wounded. Replacement Marines volunteered to cover him. Williams barely noticed. He'd entered a state of focused dissociation where only the immediate task mattered. Reach the target, burn it, move to the next target. By 1500 hours, all 7 pillboxes were destroyed. Approximately 50 Japanese soldiers were dead. Williams had maybe 30 seconds of fuel remaining. He walked back to American lines, hands shaking so badly he couldn't hold his rifle. His company commander tried to congratulate him. Williams vomited on the commander's boots, then sat down and stared at nothing for an hour. The Medal of Honor citation would describe Williams's actions as heroic individual initiative under fire. The citation was accurate but incomplete. What Williams had done required not just courage, but the willingness to become an instrument of death in its most visceral form. Flamethrowers kill by burning, suffocation, and pressure trauma simultaneously. The burning napalm consumes oxygen in enclosed spaces, suffocating occupants before flames reach them. The pressure wave from rapid combustion can rupture lungs and eardrums. Those who survive the initial burst often burn to death over minutes, not seconds. Williams had listened to men scream while they burned. He'd smelled burning human flesh, a smell that's unmistakable and never forgotten. He'd killed perhaps 30 men personally in 4 hours, killed them in ways that military doctrine classified as necessary, but that human psychology registers as atrocity. The cognitive dissonance between good Marine doing his duty and man who burns people alive would haunt Williams for decades. The casualty statistics for flamethrower operators were staggering and largely suppressed because acknowledging them might affect morale. Of the approximately 600 flamethrower operators who served on Iwo Jima, 555 became casualties, 310 killed, 245 wounded. That's a 92% casualty rate. For comparison, the overall Marine casualty rate on Iwo Jima was 38%. Flamethrower operators were twice as likely to become casualties as anyone else. The reasons were mathematical. Japanese defenders prioritized them as targets, their equipment made them visible, and the nature of their mission required close approach to enemy positions. Every flamethrower operator who landed on Iwo Jima understood they were accepting near certain death or wounding. They did it anyway because flamethrowers were essential. Pillboxes and bunkers built into volcanic rock couldn't be destroyed any other way. Without flamethrowers, the Marine advance would have stalled. The island might have taken twice as long to secure, with corresponding casualty increases. Flamethrower operators died so other Marines could advance. The mathematics were brutal but clear. The psychological burden on survivors was immense. PFC Anthony Marchetti, another flamethrower operator who survived Iwo Jima, later described the moral injury in an interview. People think war is about killing the enemy, and it is. But there's killing, and then there's what we did with flamethrowers. When you shoot someone, it's impersonal. They fall down, maybe they die, maybe they don't. You move on. With flamethrowers, you hear them scream, you smell them burning. You absolutely know that you're causing unimaginable pain, and you do it anyway, over and over, because it's your job. Because if you don't, your buddies die. But knowing it's necessary doesn't make it clean. I killed maybe 60 Japanese on Iwo Jima. I can't say I killed them in combat and feel okay about it. I burned them alive in confined spaces where they couldn't escape. That's not combat. That's execution. Justified execution, necessary execution, but execution. How do you live with that? Some guys couldn't. I know 3 flamethrower operators from Iwo Jima who committed suicide after the war. Not immediately years later, after the memories ate through everything else, I came close myself. The equipment itself was temperamental and dangerous. The M22 flamethrower consisted of 2 cylindrical tanks containing napalm fuel, a smaller nitrogen propellant tank, a flex hose, and an ignition nozzle. The system worked through pressure. Nitrogen forced fuel through the hose, where it was ignited by an electrical igniter powered by batteries. When it worked, the flamethrower was devastatingly effective. When it failed, which it did frequently in Iwo Jima's volcanic dust and humidity, operators were left carrying 70 pounds of highly flammable fuel with no way to discharge it safely. The ignition system was especially problematic. Electrical contacts would corrode from sulfur exposure, batteries would die, igniters would fail. Operators learned to carry multiple backup ignition sources, waterproof matches, cigarette lighters, signal flares. Some operators reported firing flamethrowers by manually lighting the napalm stream with cigarette lighters, a technique not covered in any training manual but born of desperate necessity. The danger of carrying a flamethrower was constant. Any penetrating hit to the fuel tanks could cause catastrophic fire. Operators who survived bullet impacts to their tanks described hearing the clang, feeling the impact, experiencing absolute certainty of imminent death, then surprise when they didn't ignite. Whether tanks failed to breach or bullets lacked incendiary capability was never determined. The operators just knew they got lucky. The tactical evolution of flamethrower employment accelerated rapidly on Iwo Jima. Early doctrine called for flamethrower operators to work in teams of 4 to 6, the operator plus rifleman for security. This proved inadequate. By late February, the standard team expanded to 8, 1 operator, 1 assistant carrying extra fuel, 4 riflemen, 1 bazooka team, 1 demolition specialist. The expanded team provided suppressive fire while the operator advanced, used bazookas to create breaches in fortifications, and employed demolitions to seal positions after flamethrower attacks. This combined arms approach, later codified as blowtorch and corkscrew, significantly improved effectiveness and slightly reduced operator casualties. The casualty rate dropped from 95% in the first week to 90% in subsequent weeks. Marginal improvement, but in absolute terms it meant 20 or 30 operators survived who otherwise would have died. Those 20 or 30 operators cleared hundreds of additional positions, allowing hundreds or thousands of other Marines to advance safely. The mathematics of sacrifice were complex and morally uncomfortable, but operationally essential. The recognition for flamethrower operators was mixed. Williams received the Medal of Honor. 5 other flamethrower operators received Navy Crosses, the second highest decoration for valor. Many received Silver Stars or Bronze Stars. But the overwhelming majority, the operators, who died clearing pillboxes, the ones who burned Japanese defenders and were themselves killed seconds later, received nothing beyond Purple Hearts issued posthumously. Their families received telegrams. The Secretary of the Navy regrets to inform you. Their names were added to casualty lists. Their actions were recorded in unit histories that few people read. The iconic images of Iwo Jima show flag raising, Marine riflemen advancing, dramatic beach landings. There are almost no photographs of flamethrower operators working. The reason is simple. Photographers didn't embed with flamethrower teams because the casualty rates made photography impossibly dangerous. The result is that the single most critical infantry specialty on Iwo Jima, the men who made advance possible by destroying fortifications that couldn't be destroyed any other way, are largely absent from the visual history of the battle. Williams survived Iwo Jima, returned to America, and lived until 2015, dying at age 92. He spent decades speaking about Iwo Jima, particularly to veteran groups and military audiences. His message was consistent. Flamethrower operators weren't heroes. They were Marines doing an impossible job because someone had to. In his final interview, recorded at age 90, Williams said, "People ask me how I had the courage to do what I did on Iwo Jima. I tell them it wasn't courage, it was responsibility. My buddies were dying. The flamethrower could save them. I had the flamethrower, so I used it. Courage would have been refusing the mission because it was too dangerous. What I did was just duty, but duty cost me something I can't get back. There's a part of my soul that's still on Iwo Jima, burning pillboxes, listening to men scream. I learned to live with it. I built a good life despite it. But it's always there. Every day for 70 years, I've thought about those 4 hours. Every night, I've dreamed about them. That's the price of being the flamethrower man. You survive when everyone expects you to die, and then you have to live with what you did to survive." March 1st, 1945, 0700 hours. Colonel James Stewart stood on the southern edge of what his Marines had begun calling the meat grinder, a 1 square mile section of volcanic plateau in northeastern Iwo Jima that contained the most lethal concentration of defensive positions on the island. Stewart commanded the 21st Marines, 3rd Marine Division, and his orders were simple and impossible. Advance north across the plateau, secure Hill 382, clear Turkey Knob, neutralize the amphitheater. Intelligence estimated 300 Japanese defenders in the sector. The actual number was closer to 800, positioned in mutually supporting bunkers and caves that Suribachi had spent 6 months perfecting. Stuart studied the terrain through binoculars. Hill 382 rose maybe 60 feet above the surrounding plateau. Not dramatic elevation, but enough to provide observation across the entire sector. Turkey Knob was a rocky outcrop to the west, bristling with cave entrances. The amphitheater was a natural depression surrounded by ridges, a killing ground where Japanese defenders could fire from 3 sides simultaneously. Stuart had fought at Bougainville and Guam. He'd seen difficult terrain before. This was different. This was terrain specifically engineered to maximize casualties. His regiment had landed with 3,200 Marines. After 10 days of combat, effective strength was 2,100. Today's attack would cost at least 500 more. Stuart gave the order to advance. The geographic features of the meat grinder sector made it a nightmare of defensive warfare. Hill 382 wasn't a single hill, but a complex of rocky outcrops, ridges, and depressions covering maybe 200 acres. The volcanic rock was harder here than elsewhere, on Iwo Jima dense basalt that couldn't be excavated easily, but could be shaped into fortifications. Japanese engineers had carved firing positions into the rock itself, creating apertures inches wide that provided fields of fire while being nearly invisible from attacking positions. The hill's northern slope descended into a draw that Marines named Bloody Gorge, a 100-yard-long depression flanked by cliffs where Japanese positions could fire down on anyone attempting to cross. Turkey Knob, 200 yards west of Hill 382, was a maze of boulders and caves connected by tunnels. The amphitheater, between the two features, was roughly circular, maybe 50 yards across, surrounded by rocky ridges 10 to 15 feet high. Japanese machine gun positions on the ridges could cover the entire depression. Any Marine entering the amphitheater was visible from multiple positions simultaneously. The 3 features Hill 382, Turkey Knob, Amphitheater formed a defensive triangle where each position supported the others. Attacking one meant receiving fire from all 3. The first assault began at 0800. 1st Battalion, 21st Marines advanced toward Hill 382 in standard formation, rifle companies in line, tanks in support, artillery preparation preceding the advance. The artillery barrage lasted 20 minutes, 155mm howitzers pounding the hill with high explosive and white phosphorus shells. The hill disappeared in smoke and dust. Observers believed the bombardment had been effective. They were wrong. When the barrage lifted and Marines began advancing, Japanese defenders emerged from protected positions and opened fire. Machine guns, mortars, artillery, rifles coordinated fire from positions that should have been destroyed but weren't. The Marines went to ground immediately, taking cover behind rocks and in shell craters. Forward progress stopped at 75 yards. Company commanders called for tank support. 4 Sherman tanks moved forward, engines roaring, 75mm guns firing at suspected positions. A magnetic mine detonated under the lead tank, immobilizing it. Anti-tank fire from a concealed 47mm gun hit the second tank, penetrating the hull and igniting ammunition. The crew burned alive while machine gun fire prevented rescue. The remaining tanks withdrew. By 0900, the assault had failed. Casualties: 43 Marines killed, 97 wounded. Territorial gain: 0 yards. The tactical problem was fundamental. Traditional infantry tactics assumed defenders could be suppressed by firepower, allowing attackers to close and destroy positions. On the meat grinder, defenders couldn't be suppressed. They fought from caves and reinforced bunkers that survived artillery and naval gunfire. When attacked directly, they'd retreat deeper into fortifications, wait for the assault to pass, then reoccupy positions. The only way to permanently neutralize a position was to physically enter it, and entering meant casualties. Every position cost lives. The meat grinder sector contained an estimated 500 significant defensive positions. At 2 to 3 casualties per position, the mathematics projected 1,500 casualties to clear 1 square mile. Colonel Stewart understood these numbers. So did every Marine in his regiment. They attacked anyway because the offensive couldn't stall, the schedule was fixed, and someone had to pay the blood price for northward advance. March 2nd brought modifications to tactics, but not improvements to outcomes. 2nd Battalion, 21st Marines attacked Turkey Knob using blowtorch and corkscrew techniques, flamethrowers and demolitions to clear cave entrances, infantry following to secure cleared positions. The advance gained 50 yards in 4 hours at a cost of 68 casualties. Japanese defenders retreated through interconnecting tunnels, reoccupied positions behind American lines, and resumed firing. By mid-afternoon, Marines had cleared 8 cave positions, and 6 of the 8 were active again within hours. That night, engineers tried sealing cave entrances with demolitions and bulldozers. They succeeded in collapsing 12 entrances. Japanese defenders dug out 7 and reopened them by dawn. The meat grinder was living up to its name. It was grinding Marines into casualties without yielding ground that could be held. The amphitheater became the focal point of some of the most intense fighting on Iwo Jima. The depression's strategic value was minimal. It was just a geographic feature, but its location between Hill 3, 82, and Turkey Knob meant advancing units had to cross it or bypass it through equally dangerous terrain. On March 3rd, 3rd Battalion, 21st Marines attempted to rush across the amphitheater in a coordinated assault. The plan called for smoke to obscure Japanese observation, artillery to suppress defensive positions, and rapid movement by infantry before defenders could react. In theory, it was sound. In practice, it was catastrophic. The smoke deployment was delayed by wind. Artillery hit some positions, but not others. When the infantry assault began, 3 companies, approximately 450 Marines, they advanced into interlocking machine gun fire from positions on all 3 sides of the amphitheater. Marines fell in windows. Corpsmen trying to reach the wounded were shot. Officers trying to organize withdrawal were killed. The assault lasted 9 minutes before survivors retreated to start positions. Final casualty count: 93 killed, 142 wounded, 52% casualties in 9 minutes, 0 territorial gain. The psychological impact on the 3rd Marine Division was approaching critical levels. The division had landed on February 19th with 19,000 men. By March 5th, combat effective strength was approximately 9,000, a 53% reduction in 2 weeks. Some of this was normal attrition, supply troops, headquarters personnel, wounded who would recover, but most of it was pure combat loss. Infantry battalions were operating at 40 to 50% strength. Companies that should have numbered 240 men were fielding 120. Platoons of 50 men had become platoons of 25. The replacements flowing in couldn't compensate for experienced personnel losses. A veteran sergeant who understood terrain, tactics, and his Marines' capabilities was worth 3 replacement privates. The division was hemorrhaging institutional knowledge and combat effectiveness simultaneously. Morale wasn't breaking. Marines continued fighting, but the psychological strain was visible. 1,000-yard stares, trembling hands, men speaking in monotones. Combat fatigue cases were increasing. 250 Marines evacuated for psychiatric casualties in the first 2 weeks, with the rate accelerating. The Japanese defenders in the meat grinder sector fought with suicidal dedication that bordered on fanaticism but was actually calculated defensive doctrine. Suribachi's orders remained in effect. No banzai charges, fight from concealment, trade American lives for time. The defenders in the northern sector understood they would die. The question was how long they could delay the American advance, and how many casualties they could inflict before death came. Captured documents revealed the defensive philosophy in explicit terms. A Japanese officer's diary recovered from a destroyed bunker stated, "We have ammunition for perhaps 10 more days, food for 7 days, water for 5 days. Then we will fight with bayonets until killed. Each day we hold this ground is one more day the Emperor has to prepare homeland defenses. Each American we kill is one less invading Japan. Our deaths here have purpose beyond survival." This wasn't fanaticism. It was rational calculation that human lives, Japanese lives, were expendable resources to be traded for strategic time. The defenders weren't trying to win. They were trying to impose maximum cost on American victory. The equipment failures in the meat grinder compounded every other problem. Tanks bogged down in volcanic sand or were destroyed by anti-tank weapons. Flamethrowers malfunctioned in dust and humidity. Radios failed, forcing commanders to rely on runners to carry messages, runners who were frequently killed in transit. Rifles jammed with volcanic dust, requiring constant cleaning that was impossible to maintain in combat. Water supplies were contaminated with sulfur, causing gastrointestinal distress that weakened Marines already operating on minimal food and sleep. Medical supplies ran short: morphine, bandages, plasma, forcing corpsmen to perform triage that left some wounded untreated. The logistics of supporting combat operations in the meat grinder bordered on impossible. Supplies had to be brought forward across exposed terrain under fire. Casualties had to be evacuated backward across the same terrain. Every supply run and every evacuation cost additional casualties. The meat grinder was consuming not just Marines, but the entire logistical system supporting them. By March 10th, the 21st Marines had been fighting in the meat grinder for 9 days. They'd advanced approximately 800 yards, less than 100 yards per day. They'd suffered 2,100 casualties, 600 killed, 1,500 wounded. That represented 66% of the regiment's original strength. For comparison, the German army in World War II typically pulled units from the line when casualties exceeded 30% because effectiveness degraded below that threshold. The 21st Marines were fighting at twice that casualty level and still attacking. The human cost was beyond quantification. Private Eugene Sledge, who would later fight at Okinawa and write about it in With the Old Breed, described the meat grinder based on interviews with survivors. It wasn't combat. It was industrial-scale slaughter conducted with rifles and grenades instead of machines. Every position was a fortress. Every advance was measured in corpses. The Marines who fought there didn't talk about victory or glory. They talked about survival, making it through one more hour, one more day. The meat grinder ground them down psychologically as much as physically. It broke something in them that never fully healed. The breakthrough finally came on March 10th through sheer attrition, rather than tactical brilliance. The Japanese defenders, after 9 days of continuous combat, had exhausted ammunition supplies, lost most of their fighting strength to casualties, and could no longer maintain coordinated defense. The 21st Marines, reinforced by elements of the 9th Marines, launched a coordinated assault using every available tank, all remaining flamethrowers, and massed artillery support. The attack succeeded not because tactics improved, but because Japanese defensive capability had finally degraded below sustainable levels. By 1400 hours on March 10th, Marines held Hill 382, Turkey Knob, and the amphitheater. The defensive triangle was broken. The cost had been staggering. Over 3,000 Marine casualties to destroy 800 Japanese defenders in 1 square mile. The exchange ratio, roughly 4 Marines killed or wounded for every Japanese defender, was the worst on Iwo Jima. It was also unavoidable. The terrain, the fortifications, and the Japanese defensive doctrine combined to create a tactical situation where casualties were the only currency that purchased ground. Colonel Stewart stood on the summit of Hill 382 on March 11th, looking north toward the remaining Japanese-held territory. His regiment had essentially been destroyed as a combat-effective unit. Survivors would be pulled from the line for reorganization and reinforcement. Fresh units would continue the offensive northward. Stewart had been told the meat grinder represented the toughest fighting on Iwo Jima. Looking north, he suspected that assessment was wrong. The terrain ahead looked equally difficult, and intelligence indicated Japanese defenders remained numerous and well-supplied. The battle wasn't ending. It was evolving into a new phase. But for the Marines of the 21st Regiment, the battle was over. They'd paid their blood price. Someone else would pay the next installment. Stewart sat down on volcanic rock and cried the only time in his military career he allowed himself that release. He cried for the 2,000 Marines he'd lost. He cried for the survivors who would carry the trauma forever. He cried because he was alive and so many weren't. And he cried because he knew this horror, this industrialized killing on volcanic rock, was necessary. That was perhaps the worst part. It was necessary. There was no alternative. The only path to ending the war ran through places like the meat grinder, and the only currency accepted was young men's lives. Stewart wiped his eyes, stood, and walked down the hill. Behind him, burial details were already at work, laying out bodies, filling out casualty tags, preparing to send America's sons home in flag-draped coffins. The meat grinder had finished grinding. March 6th, 1945, 1800 hours. In a command post carved into volcanic rock 500 yards from the front lines, 12 Marine Battalion commanders sat in a rough circle around a map of northern Iwo Jima. They represented every assault battalion in V Amphibious Corps, the survivors of 2.5 weeks of combat that had killed or wounded 15,000 Marines. Major General Graves Erskine, commanding 3rd Marine Division, had called this conference with one purpose: figure out what was working, what wasn't, and how to kill Japanese defenders more efficiently before the Corps ran out of Marines. The mood was grim but focused. These were professional officers who understood they were fighting a battle that defied existing doctrine. Every previous Pacific campaign had lasted days or perhaps 2 weeks. Iwo Jima was approaching 3 weeks, with perhaps 2 more weeks remaining. The tactics that worked at Tarawa and Saipan weren't working here. The enemy was different. The terrain was different. American forces needed to adapt, or casualties would become unsustainable. What followed was a brutal, honest assessment of failures and a collaborative development of new tactics that would influence infantry warfare for generations. The conference began with problem identification. Colonel Howard Kenyon, 3rd Battalion, 9th Marines, spoke first. "Gentlemen, we're fighting World War I tactics in a World War II battle. We're using frontal assaults against prepared positions, taking massive casualties, gaining minimal ground. Our doctrine assumes enemy positions can be suppressed by firepower. These positions can't be suppressed. They're underground. Our doctrine assumes tanks provide mobile fire support. Tanks are getting destroyed by anti-tank weapons and magnetic mines. Our doctrine assumes artillery preparation creates conditions for infantry advance. Artillery is hitting empty rock while defenders hide in tunnels. We need to acknowledge that existing doctrine is failing and develop something better, or we'll lose more Marines taking this island than we lost in the entire Guadalcanal campaign." The room was silent. Kenyon had stated what everyone knew but hadn't articulated. Traditional tactics were obsolete on Iwo Jima. The question was, what replaced them? The breakthrough came from combining successful small unit innovations into standardized procedures. Lieutenant Colonel Justice Chambers, 3rd Battalion, 25th Marines, described his unit's approach. "We've been using 8-man assault teams, 1 flamethrower operator, 1 assistant carrying extra fuel, 2 riflemen for close security, 1 bazooka team, 1 demolition specialist, and 1 squad leader to coordinate. The team approaches a target under covering fire from the rest of the platoon. Riflemen suppress the position. Bazooka creates a breach if needed. Flamethrower clears the interior. Demo specialist seals the entrance with charges. Then we move to the next position. It's slower than frontal assault, but casualty rates are roughly half what we experienced using traditional tactics. The key is coordination. Every member has a specific role, and the team functions as a unit rather than individuals attacking simultaneously." Other commanders nodded. Several battalions had independently developed similar approaches. The conference's value was recognizing that multiple units had solved the same problem and codifying the solution into standard operating procedure. The tank infantry coordination breakthrough came from hard-won experience. Tanks operating independently were vulnerable to anti-tank weapons and mines. Infantry advancing without tank support suffered excessive casualties from machine gun fire. The solution was physical connection, installing telephones on the back of Sherman tanks so infantry could communicate directly with tank crews. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Williams, 4th Tank Battalion, explained the concept. Infantry spots a target but can't approach because of machine gun fire. Instead of calling for tank support through radio, which takes time and often fails in combat conditions, the infantry squad leader picks up the phone on the tank's rear and tells the crew exactly what to shoot and where. The tank engages the target with coaxial machine gun or 75mm gun, while infantry advances under that covering fire. When infantry encounters a position too strong for small arms, they phone the tank and direct fire onto it. The tank becomes an extension of the infantry squad rather than a separate supporting element. We've tested this for 3 days. Casualty rates dropped by 30%. Advance rates increased. Artillery doctrine underwent radical revision based on the discovery that proximity-fused shells were effective against cave entrances when fired in saturation patterns. Traditional artillery fire aimed to destroy targets with direct hits. This required accuracy and was ineffective against hardened positions. The new approach used VT variable time proximity fuses that detonated shells when they detected nearby objects. A proximity-fused shell exploding near a cave entrance created a blast wave and shrapnel pattern that killed anyone in the entrance and suppressed adjacent positions. The innovation was firing saturation patterns, multiple batteries firing time on target missions where dozens of shells arrived simultaneously. Colonel Louis Metzger, 13th Marines Artillery Commander, had the data. We fired 300 proximity-fused rounds at a cave complex in the northern sector. Post-assault inspection found 43 Japanese dead in the cave entrance and connecting passages. Traditional high-explosive shells would have required 3 times as many rounds for similar effect. The key is understanding we're not trying to destroy the cave we can't. We're trying to kill defenders in the entrance before they can fire on our infantry. Proximity fuses work. We need to fire more of them. Close air support evolved from a supporting role to an integral assault element. Marine Corsair fighters, operating from captured Airfield No. 1 by March 1st, could provide air support within minutes of request. The breakthrough was reducing minimum safe distances. Traditional doctrine prohibited airstrikes within 200 yards of friendly positions due to accuracy limitations. Combat experience proved Corsair pilots could hit targets within 50 yards, using napalm and rockets. Major Robert Gaylor, commanding WW2, 18, described the evolution. Napalm is area denial weapon perfect for Iwo Jima. A 500-pound napalm canister creates a burning area roughly 100 feet in diameter. When dropped on a ridgeline or cave complex, it creates a wall of fire that kills anyone in the open and forces defenders underground. That gives our infantry 30 to 60 seconds to advance while the enemy is suppressed. We've been dropping napalm within 50 yards of Marines close enough they can feel the heat. It's dangerous, but we haven't had friendly fire casualties, and the suppression effect is dramatic. I flew 12 close support missions yesterday. Every mission, infantry reported successful advance under our cover. The conference concluded with standardization agreements. The 8-man assault team would become standard across all battalions. Tank infantry phone systems would be installed on all remaining Shermans. Artillery would prioritize proximity-fused ammunition for cave suppression. Close air support would adopt the 50-yard minimum distance protocol. Commanders would share lessons learned through daily briefings rather than waiting for formal after-action reports. The changes weren't revolutionary individually, they were tactical refinements developed by trial and error. But collectively, they represented fundamental doctrine change. Recognition that Iwo Jima required different tactics than previous battles, and willingness to abandon established procedures in favor of what actually worked. General Erskine summarized the conference. "Gentlemen, we've spent 2 weeks learning at terrible cost. The Japanese taught us that our doctrine was obsolete. We've paid tuition in blood. Now we apply what we've learned. Starting tomorrow, we fight smarter. We coordinate better. We use our advantages, firepower, technology, combined arms more effectively. We're still going to take casualties. This island is going to cost us dearly regardless of tactics. But we can reduce the cost. Every Marine we save by fighting smarter is a Marine who goes home to his family. That's why we're having this conversation. Now let's get back to our units and implement these changes." The implementation took approximately 48 hours. By March 9th, assault teams were operating across the front. Tank infantry phone systems were installed, artillery was firing predominantly proximity-fused ammunition, and close air support was hitting targets within 50 yards of Marine positions. The results were measurable. Average daily casualties, which had exceeded 900 per day in early March, dropped to approximately 500 per day by mid-March. Territorial advance rates increased from 50 to 75 yards per day to 100 to 150 yards per day. The casualty-to-advance ratio improved from 9 casualties per 10 yards to 5 casualties per 10 yards. These weren't dramatic improvements. Iwo Jima remained brutally costly, but they were meaningful. Over the battle's final 2 weeks, the tactical innovations saved an estimated 1,500 to 2,000 Marine casualties. That represented 1,500 to 2,000 men who survived when they otherwise would have died or been wounded. The innovations also accelerated the battle's conclusion by perhaps 5 days, preventing an additional 2,500 casualties that would have occurred had the battle lasted longer. The innovations developed on Iwo Jima became foundational doctrine for future operations. The 8-man assault team became standard infantry tactics in Korea and Vietnam. Tank infantry telephone systems remained standard through the 1970s. Artillery doctrine embraced proximity fuses as primary ammunition for infantry support. Close air support doctrine adopted reduced minimum distances, eventually leading to modern close air support techniques where aircraft support infantry within meters of target. Infantry training incorporated cave and tunnel fighting techniques developed on Iwo Jima. The battle's tactical legacy extended far beyond its immediate strategic objectives. Iwo Jima became a laboratory where American forces learned to fight an enemy that refused conventional battle, and the lessons learned shaped how America fought for the next half-century. But the learning came at costs that statistical analysis couldn't capture. The 15,000 casualties suffered before the tactical innovations took effect weren't abstract numbers, they were specific young men who died because doctrine lagged reality. Private Morrison, the replacement who landed on March 7th, would have benefited from the tactical innovations if they'd been implemented on D-Day. Instead, he landed into combat conducted using obsolete tactics, survived through luck as much as skill, and carried trauma that tactical improvements couldn't have prevented but might have reduced. The tragic reality was that military organizations learn through failure, and failure in combat means casualties. The Marines who died in the first 2 weeks of Iwo Jima paid the price for tactical education that saved lives in weeks 3 and 4. There's no moral resolution to this reality. It's simply how war functions. Young men die, survivors learn from their deaths, and apply those lessons to save other young men. The cycle continues until the war ends or everyone is dead. Colonel Kenyon, who'd spoken first at the conference, survived Iwo Jima and retired as a major general in 1963. In his final interview before his death in 1988, he reflected on the March 6th conference. "People ask me what I'm most proud of in my career. They expect me to say leading troops in combat or receiving decorations, but the truth is, I'm most proud of that conference. We sat down, acknowledged our failures, checked our egos, and figured out how to do better. That's harder than it sounds. Military culture rewards confidence and punishes admission of error. But on Iwo Jima, we couldn't afford ego. Marines were dying. We had to fix the problems regardless of what fixing them said about our previous decisions, so we fixed them. That conference probably saved 2,000 lives. That matters more than any medal. The tragedy is that we couldn't have that conference on D-Day. We needed combat experience to understand what worked. So 15,000 Marines paid for our education. That's the burden I carry. We learned. But we learned too late for thousands of men. I can't change that. I can only ensure their deaths taught us lessons we passed forward. That's what I tried to do for the rest of my career. Make sure no Marine died teaching a lesson we'd already learned at places like Iwo Jima. Some succeeded, some didn't. But we tried. That has to count for something. March 21st, 1945, 0400 hours. In a command bunker 75 feet beneath northern Iwo Jima, Lieutenant General Tadamichi Suribachi sat at a wooden table, writing by candlelight. Above him, American Marines were sleeping in foxholes, preparing for another day of attack. Around him, 300 Japanese soldiers, the survivors of a garrison that once numbered 21,000, prepared for what they knew would be their final battle. Kuribayashi's diary entry was brief and matter-of-fact. Day 31. Garrison strength approximately 300 combat-effective soldiers. Ammunition sufficient for perhaps 2 days of sustained combat. Water supplies, exhausted men drinking condensed moisture from tunnel walls. Food supplies exhausted 3 days ago. Medical supplies gone. Wounded dying without morphine or treatment. Expected American assault today or tomorrow will overwhelm our remaining positions. I have ordered no retreat, no surrender. We will fight until killed. I expect to die within 48 hours. My final order to the garrison: make the Americans pay for every yard with blood. If we must die, let our deaths be expensive." He signed the entry, closed the diary, and stood to inspect what remained of his command. The reduction of Japanese-held territory had been methodical and costly. On D-Day, Suribachi controlled the entire island. By Day 10, he'd lost the southern third, including Mount Suribachi. By Day 20, he'd lost the central airfields and held only the northern third. By Day 30, American Marines had compressed Japanese defenders into a pocket approximately 1 mile long and half a mile wide in the island's northwestern corner. The territory was rough volcanic plateau cut by ravines and ridges, terrain that favored defense but couldn't withstand unlimited assault. Suribachi understood the mathematics. He commanded perhaps 3,000 soldiers. Exact numbers were unknown because communications had broken down as units were overrun. The Americans had 50,000 Marines on the island, with unlimited artillery, air support, and naval gunfire. The outcome was predetermined. The only variable was time. How long could his garrison hold? How many Americans would die before the end came? The conditions in the northern pocket were approaching medieval in their horror. Water had run out 5 days earlier. Japanese soldiers were licking moisture from tunnel walls, drinking their own urine, sucking on pebbles to generate saliva. Food had been exhausted. Men were weakening from starvation, moving slowly, struggling to lift weapons. Medical care was non-existent. The wounded lay in tunnel chambers, untreated, dying slowly. Some had been wounded weeks ago, infected wounds turned gangrenous, amputations performed without anesthesia, using combat knives and hacksaws. The smell in the tunnels was overwhelming. Excrement, rotting flesh, sulfur, smoke. Sanitation had collapsed. Diseases spread. Some men were too weak to fight but couldn't leave, because leaving meant death. They waited in darkness for American flamethrowers, or bullets, or starvation, or disease, whichever arrived first. Yet Suribachi's orders remained. Fight from concealment, no banzai charges, maximum American casualties. Even in these desperate circumstances, he enforced tactical discipline. When 2 junior officers proposed a final mass charge against American positions, a glorious death in combat rather than slow decay underground, Suribachi refused. His reasoning was coldly logical. 300 men in a banzai charge would kill perhaps 50 Americans before being wiped out in minutes. 300 men defending from fortified positions might kill 300 Americans over several days. The mathematics favored defense. Glory didn't matter. Killing Americans mattered. The officers obeyed. The garrison would fight from positions until positions became untenable, then retreat deeper into the tunnel network, then fight again. They would stretch American casualties across as much time as possible. That was the mission. That remained the mission until everyone was dead. March 21st brought the final American assault on Suribachi's pocket. The attack involved elements of 3 Marine divisions, 4th, 5th, and 3rd, supported by massed artillery, airstrikes, and naval gunfire. The bombardment began at 0600 hours, 150 artillery pieces firing for 30 minutes, followed by airstrikes dropping napalm and 500-pound bombs, followed by naval guns targeting suspected command posts. The preparation was overwhelming, more explosive tonnage delivered to 1 square mile than many cities received during the entire war. When the bombardment lifted at 0700, Marines advanced expecting minimal resistance. They encountered fierce, coordinated defensive fire. Suribachi's garrison was starving and dehydrated and outgunned. They were not defeated. They'd survived worse bombardments. They would fight until they couldn't fight anymore. The battle for the northern pocket lasted 5 days. Each day followed a similar pattern: American bombardment, Marine advance, Japanese defensive fire, close combat for specific positions, gradual reduction of Japanese-held territory. The advance measured 50 to 100 yards daily, purchasing ground with casualties that hadn't decreased despite tactical improvements. The Japanese defenders had nowhere to retreat. Each position lost was permanent. Each soldier killed couldn't be replaced, yet resistance remained effective. A Marine company would assault a cave complex, destroy the entrance, declare it cleared, then receive fire from that position hours later because Japanese soldiers dug their way out through rubble. Flamethrower teams would clear a tunnel system, seal all entrances, move to the next objective, then discover Japanese defenders emerging from hidden exits and attacking from behind. The northern pocket was collapsing, but fighting until the absolute end. On March 24th, Marine patrols discovered Kuribayashi's command bunker. The complex was the most elaborate position on Iwo Jima. Multiple chambers connected by passages, reinforced concrete ceilings, electrical wiring for communications, maps showing defensive positions, personal effects belonging to the general. But Kuribayashi wasn't there. Intelligence estimated he'd evacuated to a smaller position deeper in the pocket as the perimeter contracted. The discovery of the empty command post was psychologically significant for Marines who'd fought against Kuribayashi's tactical genius for 34 days. Finding his headquarters felt like capturing the brain of the defensive network. But the brain had moved. Kuribayashi was still alive, still commanding, still killing Marines. The hunt for the Japanese commander became an operational objective, not because killing one general mattered strategically, but because Kuribayashi had become symbol of the resistance. Finding him would symbolize final victory. March 25th, approximately 2200 hours. Historical records become uncertain about Kuribayashi's final hours. Japanese survivors, the handful captured or who surrendered later, provided conflicting accounts. One account claimed Kuribayashi led a final attack by 300 survivors against American positions near the northwestern coast. The attack was repulsed with heavy casualties on both sides. Kuribayashi allegedly died in the fighting, though his body was never definitively identified. Another account suggested Kuribayashi committed ritual suicide in a cave after sending his final message to Tokyo: "We have fought well, forgive us." A third account, from a Japanese soldier who surrendered in 1949, claimed Kuribayashi was wounded in late March, retreated to a deep tunnel, and died of wounds and starvation in early April. The truth was likely never known. Kuribayashi disappeared into death as he'd lived in combat, effectively, without glory, achieving maximum impact with minimal visibility. What wasn't uncertain was the final casualty count from the northern pocket. Between March 21st and March 26, approximately 3,000 Japanese soldiers were killed. Another 216 were captured, many too wounded to resist, some who'd passed out from dehydration or starvation and were captured unconscious. Of the 216 captured during the entire battle, half were taken in the final week. The American casualties in the northern pocket were 1,900, 500 killed, 1,400 wounded. The exchange ratio was roughly 3 Americans for every 2 Japanese, worse than earlier battle phases, because the Japanese had nowhere to retreat, nothing to lose, and therefore fought with absolute desperation. The final week of Iwo Jima was as costly as the first week, demonstrating that tactical improvements couldn't eliminate casualties when fighting an enemy accepting death as inevitable. On March 26, 1945, at 1400 hours, Admiral Nimitz declared Iwo Jima officially secured. The ceremony was brief. Flag raised, speeches given, photographers capturing the moment. The reality was messier. Japanese holdouts remained in sealed caves throughout the island. Isolated soldiers continued fighting for days, weeks, in some cases years. The last confirmed Japanese combat death occurred 3 days after the island was declared secure. The last surrender occurred in 1949. Iwo Jima wasn't secured on March 26th. It was conquered. The distinction matters. Secured implies pacified, controlled, safe. Conquered implies defeated, but not necessarily subdued. Iwo Jima was conquered at terrible cost, and residual danger remained for years. Kuribayashi's legacy was complex and contested. From an American perspective, he was a formidable enemy who'd inflicted unprecedented casualties and prolonged a battle that should have lasted days into 5 weeks. From a Japanese perspective, his success was mixed. He'd held Iwo Jima longer than expected and killed more Americans than any previous Pacific battle commander, but he'd still lost the island. His tactical innovations, defense in depth, fighting from concealment, prohibiting banzai charges proved effective, but couldn't change the fundamental strategic situation. Japan was losing. Iwo Jima was always going to fall. What Suribachi achieved was making American victory expensive. Whether that expense mattered strategically remains debated. Iwo Jima didn't prevent the bombing of Japan. It didn't force American negotiation. It didn't change the war's outcome. What it did was kill nearly 7,000 Americans and wound 19,000 more. From Suribachi's perspective, that was success. His mission wasn't to win. His mission was to impose cost. He succeeded absolutely. In the decades after the war, Suribachi's reputation evolved. Initially, he was largely forgotten, another Japanese general who died defending a lost cause. In the 1980s and 90s, historians discovered his letters and diaries, revealing a sophisticated, educated officer who understood Japan would lose but fought anyway out of duty. His tactical innovations were studied in military academies worldwide. The 2006 film, Letters from Iwo Jima, portrayed him sympathetically as a tragic figure, a man forced to fight a war he knew was unwinnable, trying to preserve his soldiers' lives through tactics his superiors considered dishonorable. The film resonated because it revealed the human dimension of a general who'd been reduced to statistics. 21,000 Japanese killed, 26,000 Americans casualties, 36 days of combat. Behind those numbers was a middle-aged man writing letters home he knew would never be answered, developing tactics he knew couldn't win, dying in darkness, knowing his death would be meaningless, except for the American lives he'd taken with him. There's no glory in that story. There's only tragedy for Suribachi, for his garrison, for the Marines who fought them, for everyone consumed by a battle that achieved strategic objectives at costs that haunt everyone involved. Suribachi's body was never found. His grave is somewhere under volcanic rock, on an island he transformed into hell on Earth. That's his legacy. He's buried in the ground he made Americans pay to take. 26,000 casualties worth of payment. Whether that purchase was worth the price is a question every generation must answer for itself. March 20th, 1945, 0900 hours. Navy Corpsman John Doc Bradley knelt in volcanic sand beside a 19-year-old Marine whose name he didn't know and whose wounds he couldn't treat. The Marine, a private, fresh-faced, from somewhere in the Midwest, judging by his accent, had taken shrapnel from a mortar round to his abdomen and chest. Bradley could see intestines through the torn uniform. The wound was unsurvivable. On a hospital ship with surgeons and blood supplies and antibiotics, maybe the kid had a chance. Here, 400 yards from the beach, with artillery still falling sporadically and evacuation requiring carrying him across open ground under fire, the kid had minutes. Bradley had already used his last morphine syringe an hour ago. He had bandages, sulfa powder, and words. He applied the bandages, knowing they were inadequate. He poured sulfa powder into wounds where it would do nothing. And he lied. "You're going to be okay. We're getting you out of here. Hospital ship has great doctors. You'll be home in a month." The Marine smiled weakly. "Thanks, Doc. Tell my mom I wasn't scared." Bradley nodded. "You weren't scared. You were brave as hell." The Marine died maybe 2 minutes later. Bradley closed the kid's eyes, took his dog tags, moved to the next casualty. After 31 days on Iwo Jima, Bradley had stopped counting how many Marines he'd watched die. The number didn't matter. Each death was individual, specific, unrepeatable. Statistics couldn't capture that. The final casualty figures for Iwo Jima were staggering in their precision and horrifying in their implications. Of 70,647 Americans who participated in the operation, 26,038 became casualties, 6,821 killed in action, 19,217 wounded. That represented a 37% casualty rate. More than 1 in 3 Americans who landed on Iwo Jima was killed or wounded. For infantry units that did the actual fighting, casualty rates exceeded 50%. Some rifle companies suffered 70 to 80% casualties. The 4th Marine Division landed with 19,475 Marines and suffered 9,068 casualties, 47%. The 5th Marine Division landed with 19,720 Marines and suffered 9,212 casualties, 47%. The 3rd Marine Division, which landed partway through the battle, suffered 6,336 casualties from approximately 19,000, engaged 33%. Every division was shattered. Every regiment was decimated. Every company had lost dozens of men. The numbers described organizational destruction. But organizations don't bleed. People do. The age demographics revealed the battle's particular cruelty. The average age of Americans killed on Iwo Jima was 19.5 years old. The youngest confirmed killed in action was 17, a Marine who'd lied about his age to enlist. The oldest was 43, a senior officer killed by artillery while observing an assault. But the vast majority were 18 to 21, recent high school graduates, boys who'd been playing football or working on farms or attending college 2 years earlier. They'd been drafted or enlisted, trained for 6 months, shipped to the Pacific, and fed into combat that killed or wounded them before they'd had chance to develop the survival instincts that kept veterans alive. Private Morrison, who'd landed on March 7th, represented the statistical average perfectly. 19 years old, minimal training, thrown into combat, survived through luck and the protection of experienced Marines who often died protecting replacements they barely knew. The youth of American casualties meant the loss wasn't just numerical, it was generational. 6,821 young men who would never marry, never have children, never contribute to their communities. The demographic echo of Iwo Jima reverberated through American society for decades. The Medal of Honor statistics were equally revealing. 27 Medals of Honor were awarded for actions on Iwo Jima, more than any other battle in American history. 14 were awarded to living recipients, 13 posthumously. The sheer number suggested extraordinary heroism was commonplace on Iwo Jima, but the reality was more nuanced. Military decorations require witnesses and formal citation processes. Many acts of extraordinary courage went unrecognized because everyone who witnessed them died, or because in the chaos of combat no one filed the paperwork, or because what seemed extraordinary on Iwo Jima became normalized. Corpsman Bradley, who would receive the Navy Cross for actions during the flag raising on Suribachi, performed similar heroics daily for 5 weeks. He received 1 decoration. How many decorations should he have received? How many other corpsmen, riflemen, demolition specialists, tank crews, artillery forward observers performed similar heroics and received nothing beyond survival? The Medal of Honor recipients represented visible peaks on a landscape of courage that was far more extensive than official recognition suggested. The individual stories behind the statistics revealed patterns of sacrifice that statistics couldn't capture. Private First Class Douglas Jacobson, 23 years old from New York, single-handedly destroyed 16 Japanese positions over a 4-hour period on February 26th, killing 75 enemy soldiers, while armed only with a bazooka and rifle. He survived, received the Medal of Honor, returned to New York, worked as a salesman, died in 1982, having rarely spoken about Iwo Jima. Private First Class Jacqueline H. Lucas, 17 years old from North Carolina, the youngest Medal of Honor recipient in World War II, threw himself on 2 grenades to protect 3 fellow Marines, survived with massive injuries, spent months in hospitals, received the Medal of Honor from President Truman, and lived until 2008, dying at age 80 from cancer unrelated to his wounds. His survival was near miraculous. The grenades detonated. Lucas should have died. That he lived suggested something beyond statistics, chance, fate, divine intervention, depending on one's perspective. What wasn't debatable was that Lucas willingly accepted death to save 3 men he'd known for days. That calculus trading 1 life for 3 defined combat on Iwo Jima. The corpsmen bore particularly heavy psychological burdens. Navy medical personnel attached to Marine units operated under impossible conditions, unarmed per Geneva Convention, responsible for treating casualties under fire, expected to risk death to save wounded Marines. Corpsman casualties on Iwo Jima exceeded 200 killed and 800 wounded. Every Marine infantry company had corpsmen. Every company lost corpsmen. The corpsmen who survived carried trauma distinct from combat trauma. They'd watched men die despite their efforts, made triage decisions that meant some wounded went untreated, and bore responsibility however irrational for deaths they couldn't prevent. Bradley's post-war life illustrated this burden. He became a funeral director in Wisconsin, married, raised children, and never discussed Iwo Jima with his family. When James Bradley, his son, discovered his father had been a flag raiser, photographed in the famous image, John Bradley's response was dismissive. The heroes of Iwo Jima are the guys who didn't come back. He attended flag raiser reunions, but remained silent during discussions of the battle. The photograph that made him famous was, to him, a moment of luck in 5 weeks of horror. The real story was the hundreds of wounded he'd treated, the dozens who died under his hands, the knowledge that his medical training was inadequate for the injuries he encountered. That story didn't fit American narratives of glorious victory, so Bradley kept it private for 50 years. The Japanese casualties were even more staggering in their completeness. Of approximately 21,000 Japanese defenders, roughly 18,844 were killed, 89%. Only 1,083 were captured, and many of these were unconscious from wounds or starvation when captured. Several hundred more remained in sealed caves, dying slowly of wounds, disease, or starvation over weeks and months. The Japanese casualty rate on Iwo Jima was the highest of any Pacific battle, approaching total annihilation. For comparison, the Japanese garrison on Saipan suffered 75% casualties. On Tarawa, 95%. Iwo Jima exceeded both. Kuribayashi's tactics preserved his garrison longer than traditional defensive doctrine would have, but the ultimate outcome was near complete destruction. Every Japanese soldier who landed on Iwo Jima knew they wouldn't leave. Kuribayashi had told them explicitly. The question wasn't survival, but how many Americans they'd kill before dying. By that metric, they succeeded. The exchange ratio was roughly 3 Americans wounded for every 2 Japanese killed, far better than most Pacific battles where Japanese casualties far exceeded American casualties. But success measured in corpse ratios is a strange, horrible calculus that both sides accepted as normal. The letters home, thousands of them, written by Marines between combat actions, held by chaplains, mailed if the writer died, revealed the psychological landscape behind the statistics. Private Eugene Sledge, who would later fight at Okinawa, collected some of these letters for his memoir. One, written by a Marine whose name Sledge withheld, read, "Dear Mom, if you're reading this, I'm dead. I want you to know I wasn't scared when it happened. That's probably a lie, but I want you to believe it anyway. This island is hell. I don't know why we're fighting for it. It's just volcanic rock and sand. But orders are orders. Tell Dad I'm sorry I won't be coming home to help with the farm. Tell Susie her big brother loves her. Tell everyone I died doing my duty. That's true, at least. I don't know if my duty mattered, but I did it. That has to count for something. Don't cry too much. I had a good life, even if it was short. Love, Tommy." The letter was found on a private killed on March 2nd. He was 19 years old. His body was shipped home 6 months later, buried in Iowa, and his gravestone noted, "Died in service of his country, Iwo Jima, March 2, 1945. The gravestone didn't mention that Tommy had been in combat for 11 days, that he'd probably never fired his weapon at an enemy he could see, that he died from a mortar round fired from a position 300 yards away by a Japanese soldier who never knew Tommy existed. Statistics called Tommy 1 Kia 02 March 1945 Iwo Jima. His mother called him Tommy and cried every day for the rest of her life. The long-term medical consequences extended far beyond the battlefield. Of the 19,217 wounded, several thousand suffered injuries that required months or years of treatment, amputations, facial reconstructions, traumatic brain injuries, severe burns. The medical technology of 1945 was primitive compared to modern standards. Antibiotics were recent innovations. Plastic surgery was crude. Prosthetics were uncomfortable and limited in function. Many wounded Marines survived, but faced lifetimes of pain, disability, and medical complications. The VA hospitals filled with Iwo Jima casualties spent decades treating the battle's consequences. Some veterans required multiple surgeries spread across years. Some developed infections from embedded shrapnel that couldn't be removed. Some lost limbs to gangrene after initial treatment failed. The 19,000 wounded weren't a fixed number. They were 19,000 individual trajectories of suffering that extended decades beyond the battle. Statistics didn't capture that. The psychiatric casualties were perhaps the most underreported aspect of Iwo Jima. The official count listed 2,648 Marines evacuated for combat fatigue, the term used for what would later be called PTSD. But this significantly understated the psychological toll. Combat fatigue evacuations included only severe cases, men who became catatonic, violent, suicidal, or otherwise unable to function. Thousands more experienced psychological trauma but remained functional enough to continue fighting. Post-war studies suggested 40 to 50% of Iwo Jima veterans experienced some PTSD symptoms: nightmares, hypervigilance, depression, substance abuse, relationship difficulties. Many never sought treatment. Mental health care in the 1940s and 50s was stigmatized and limited. Veterans were expected to get over it and resume normal lives. Many couldn't. Divorce rates among Iwo Jima veterans exceeded national averages. Suicide rates were elevated. Alcoholism was common. The psychiatric casualties of Iwo Jima continued accumulating for decades after the battle ended, and no official count captured them. On March 26, 1945, when Admiral Nimitz declared Iwo Jima secured, the casualty lists were still being compiled. The final count wouldn't be completed until April. The telegrams, "The Secretary of the Navy regrets to inform you," continued arriving at American homes through early summer. Each telegram transformed a statistic into specific, located grief. A mother in Iowa learning her son died. A wife in California learning she was a widow. Parents in Georgia learning their only child wouldn't be coming home. The 6,821 killed weren't evenly distributed across America. Small towns that sent dozens of boys to the Marines might lose 3 or 4 on Iwo Jima, creating concentrated grief. The town of Bedford, Virginia, population 3,500, lost 3 Marines on Iwo Jima out of 47 who served. That represented 6% of their young male population killed on one island in 5 weeks. The statistical casualties became community tragedies, reshaping demographics and memories for generations. 60 years later, Bedford would build a memorial naming every resident who served on Iwo Jima, the living and the dead, the wounded and the whole. Because the town understood what statistics couldn't capture. These weren't numbers. These were Tommy and James and Robert boys who'd played football, worked in stores, dated local girls, left for war, and either didn't return or returned changed in ways that meant they never truly came home. March 27, 1945, 0600 hours. Marine Private Lewis Martin was pulling security duty on what was supposed to be a secured island when machine gun fire erupted from a cave entrance that intelligence had declared destroyed 3 days earlier. Martin hit the ground, scrambled for cover behind volcanic rock, and returned fire at the cave mouth. Behind him, 3 other Marines were pinned down. One was wounded, bleeding from a leg wound, screaming for a corpsman. The cave was maybe 60 yards away, positioned on a ridge overlooking the supply depot Martin's squad was guarding. For 36 hours, the official narrative had been that Iwo Jima was secure, organized resistance had ended, the battle was over. Martin, lying in volcanic sand while bullets kicked up dust around him, understood that secure was a bureaucratic fiction. The island wasn't secure. It was conquered but not pacified. Japanese soldiers remained alive in hundreds of sealed caves, living on stored supplies, waiting for opportunities to emerge and kill Americans. The battle wasn't over. It had just transformed from conventional combat to a deadly game of hide-and-seek that would last for months, perhaps years. Martin called for support and prepared for a siege that wasn't supposed to be happening. The declaration of secure status on March 26 was technically accurate, but practically misleading. Organized Japanese resistance, coordinated defense under central command with strategic objectives had ended. Kuribayashi's command structure had collapsed. Remaining defenders weren't executing battle plans. They were surviving in isolated pockets without communication, resupply, or hope. But isolated pockets remained numerous and dangerous. Intelligence estimated between 500 and 1,000 Japanese soldiers remained alive on Iwo Jima in late March. scattered across the island in caves and tunnels that Americans had sealed without clearing. These holdouts had food and water for weeks, ammunition for sustained firefights, and nothing to lose. Some were waiting for rescue that would never come. Some were hoping to inflict casualties before dying. Some were simply existing, day by day, in darkness. All were dangerous. The systematic elimination of holdouts became a grinding, unglamorous operation that received little attention compared to the dramatic battle phases, but remained deadly. Marine engineers developed specialized procedures: locate a sealed cave, call for infantry security, use bulldozers to clear rubble from entrances, send in flamethrower teams if Japanese fire indicated occupancy, seal the entrance permanently with explosives and concrete if no fire was received. The assumption was that any cave not responding to challenges was either empty or contained dead defenders. This assumption was often wrong. Some defenders remained silent, hoping Marines would conclude the cave was empty and move on. Days or weeks later, they'd emerge, attack supply depots or isolated patrols, then retreat underground. Other defenders responded to challenges with gunfire, requiring full assault operations indistinguishable from earlier battle phases. Between March 27th and April 10th, American forces killed an additional 1,600, 2 Japanese soldiers, and captured 247, bringing total Japanese casualties to 20,000, 446 killed, and 1,330 captured. The mopping up operations cost 203 American lives and 649 wounded. The battle was over, but people kept dying. The most extensive holdout was discovered in the northern sector on April 3rd. Marines sealing cave entrances near the coast reported receiving fire from what appeared to be a large tunnel complex. Engineers estimated the complex might hold 50 to 100 defenders based on observed firing positions. The complex was assaulted using tactics developed during the battle: artillery and airstrikes on known entrances, infantry cordoned to prevent escape, flamethrower teams clearing accessible passages. The operation took 4 days. Final count: 187 Japanese soldiers killed, 23 captured. The captured soldiers were emaciated, dehydrated, some too weak to walk. They'd been living on minimal rations, drinking condensed water, in total darkness because generator fuel had run out weeks ago. Some had untreated wounds infected with gangrene. All believed the war was still ongoing. When informed Japan would surrender in August, several refused to believe it, assuming American propaganda. The prisoners were evacuated to POW camps, where many required weeks of hospitalization before they could be interrogated. Their stories revealed the nightmare of holdout existence: darkness, starvation, disease, psychological collapse, and endless waiting for death that came slowly or suddenly but always came eventually.